Chapter 1. Beverly Snow fluffed her mother's pillow and laid the back of her hand against her forehead. "Are you feeling any better? It still feels to me as if you're running a fever. I think we should head to the ER." Her mother shook her head. "Absolutely not. They're just going to put me on machines. If I need machines to keep me alive, then I don't want to live. Mom, please. No. I've been in this bed and in wheelchairs for 20 years. I'm not going to stay here anymore. It's my time. It's time for me to see your father and sister." Her mother was racked with a fit of coughing, but the coughing was weak. Much too weak to clear her lungs. When it calmed, she continued. "I've been your burden for too long. You need to live your own life. You are my life, Mom." Well, her mother and the business she ran from her mother's bedside. "I'm not going to sit here and let you die." More coughing. "We both know I have pneumonia. I've been a quadriplegic for too long. The doctor said my body couldn't handle anything else. This is the end for me. I can die at home with dignity, or you can take me to the hospital and let them insert all sorts of tubes that will make my death long and excruciating. Please let me die with dignity." Beverly felt the tears flowing down her face as she nodded. Her mother was right, and they both knew it. She deserved to die the way she wanted to die. "All right. I hate it, but I'll do it. Promise me you'll talk to Lachele after I'm gone." Beverly's brow furrowed. Lachele was a member of their congregation, and she visited her mother at least twice a month without fail. Beverly knew she was a good woman, but she didn't know much about her. When her mother had a visitor, Beverly seized the opportunity to do some work or run errands. "Why? She'll know." Her mother coughed again, turning her head to the side. It was the only part of her body she had full control of. She couldn't even cough as hard as she needed to. Beverly kissed her mother's forehead. "I'll let you sleep." She wouldn't leave her bedside though. She couldn't. Her mother had been injured in a car accident after Beverly's high school graduation. The whole family had been together, laughing as they talked about some of the silly things that had happened. None of them had seen the semi bearing down on them. The driver's brakes had gone out. He'd honked his horn, but there were so many car horns in Manhattan that they hadn't paid any attention. Her father and sister had been killed instantly. Her mother had been left paralyzed. Only Beverly had walked away unscathed, and she'd felt guilty every day of her life since. Her mother was sleeping, so she picked up the baby quilt she was making from the floor, under the edge of her mother's bed. She didn't have much left to do on it, and then another blanket would be ready for the foundation she ran. She ran it much like a business, but the truth was, she made very little money from it. She and her mother lived on Social Security and the residual income from her father's stock investments. Before his death, he'd been the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. His life insurance had done much good, but it was almost gone. It took a lot of money to care for someone around the clock. Beverly was with her mother 16 hours a day, but they had to hire people to help at night. Beverly hadn't had the heart to ask her mother to move to a smaller space. Instead, she'd scrimped and saved every dime she could, doing her best to make the money they had stretch for as long as possible. Once her mother died, the sale of their home would give Beverly enough to live on for the rest of her life. Until then, she would clip every coupon she could to save money. She did the last few stitches, folding the quilt with love. Her foundation provided quilts and Afghans to babies who were born addicted to drugs and alcohol. She loved that she could keep the infants warm. Many of the women who sewed and crocheted for her would go in and hold the babies, but she hadn't ever been able to. Her mother kept her too busy for that. Not 5 hours later, her mother breathed her last breath. Beverly dropped her head onto her mother's shoulder and sobbed. Saying goodbye to someone she loved so very much was harder than she'd imagined it could ever be. Yes, she was free to live her own life now, but she would have been so much happier to share her time with her mother. At the funeral a few days later, Lachele Simpson approached her. Beverly knew she was a counselor, but there were rumors she'd started a new business as well. Beverly didn't know or care what the new business was, because she was so busy with her mother. I'm sorry for your loss. Beverly nodded, her eyes dry, but still red from the hours upon hours of grieving. Thank you. The last time I saw your mother, she asked me to talk to you after she died. She's known her end was close for a few months now. I know she has, and she told me the same thing. I can come to your office, if you'd like. Surely, she could find time to talk to her mother's friend around putting the house up for sale, and going through all her mother's things to get everything in order. Talking to a real estate agent, she'd decided to sell the place furnished, which would help, but not nearly as much as she'd like it to. There's no need for you to do that. Why don't I come over on Saturday afternoon? I can help you go through some of your mother's things, and we can talk then. She was adamant that you need my services. Beverly frowned. I don't know about that. I mean, I'm very sad about Mom's death, but I don't think I'm bad enough that I need mental health services. Lachele's eyes widened. I'm not talking about mental health services. It's my other business she wants you to take advantage of. Other business? You really don't know, do you? Lachele shook her head. No time now. I'll explain it all tomorrow. Your place at 2? Sure. Beverly had the real estate agent coming at 1, but that should give them enough time. She hoped. After a quick hug, Lachele disappeared, and Beverly talked to the next person in the long line to speak with her. Her parents had once been a very active part of the social scene in Manhattan. Her mother was still loved and respected by many for her hours and hours of charity work. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you. The words were automatic now. How long would she be saying them? Beverly was just finishing up with the real estate agent when Lachele arrived the next day. She invited the older woman to wait in the parlor while she finished signing papers. Do you think it will sell quickly? The agent shrugged. It's a beautiful home and has always been well maintained. It's right on the edge of Central Park, which will give it some added resale value. I think it'll be off your hands in less than 3 months. Beverly nodded. That would be just about when her money ran out, so it would be good timing. Of course, without her mother needing her every minute of the day, she could get a job too. She'd wait tables if she had to. She'd given up her college scholarships to stay home and care for her mom. Life would certainly be different now. After seeing the agent off, she wandered back to the room she'd left Lachele in. Thanks for coming. Can I get you something to drink? Lachele shook her head. Nope. I'm good. I just want to have that talk your mother insisted we have. Have you ever heard of matrimony? Beverly sat down across from Lachele, shaking her head. No, I haven't. Why? Well, it's a company I run. I introduce people at the altar. Beverly blinked a few times, trying to understand why this should matter to her. You mean you're a matchmaker? Yes, I am. And your mother thinks I should match you with someone now that she's gone. She wanted me to do it before, but there was no way I could while you were caring for her full time. Why? Beverly didn't want to think about marriage. She just wanted to have time to grieve and run her little foundation. Because she thinks that you've given up every chance of happiness you've ever had to take care of her. She wants you to marry whomever I find for you and live happily ever after. How on earth does she think I can live happily ever after if I'm marrying a man I've never met before? Has she lost her mind? Lachele laughed. I've not yet had a bad match. I put you through an entire day of psychological testing before I match you with someone. And that works? Beverly couldn't help but be skeptical. She'd only dated one boy in her life, and he'd promised that they would be together forever. After the accident, he'd expected her to leave her mother and go on with her plan of attending college she'd had before. Obviously, he hadn't known her at all. It always has. I promise. Are you willing to go through the tests and find the man of your dreams? I gave up dreaming about a man a long time ago. I can't imagine what my mother was thinking. I have a foundation to run. I know you do. But you can really run it from anywhere, right? It's not like you're meeting with people here in the city. Well, I guess I can. Will you give me time to think about it? I really had given up all thoughts of happily ever after. I understand that, Beverly. But this was your mother's last wish for you. She talked to me about it every single time I came here to visit her. Beverly groaned. How could she say no to her mother's last wish? I'll go through the testing. I'm not sure it's what I want, but I'll do it if it's what Mom wanted for me. Lachele smiled. How about Monday? I've already cleared my schedule. If you want, I'll come here. I can help you pack up your personal belongings and sort through your mother's things. The work needs to be done anyway. I'll just record the session, and I can input the information later. Sure. That sounds good. I'll make sure I have boxes ready to pack when you get here. Morning? I'll be here around 9. I've never been an early morning person. We'll work then. Beverly stood up, taking Lachele's hand in both of hers. Your friendship was very important to my mom. I think I see why now. Thank you for continuing to visit her for so many years. Others started, but they all died out. Only you kept coming. Lachele hugged Beverly, feeling the girl tense up. She hadn't been touched much in the past 20 years. She needed to get used to it. Colin Geller walked back toward his cabin. He'd been a ranger at Denali National Park in Alaska for 20 years. He liked dealing with the trees and wildlife. He didn't like dealing with the tourists quite as much, but they came with the territory. They paid for the park to keep going, and he was happy to be able to live out his life there. When he got into the cabin, he looked through the letters that had been delivered. July was upon them. Soon, winter would start again, and he'd be buried in snow. He stopped when he saw a letter he'd been waiting for. Dr. Lachele Simpson. He'd had her come up at the end of May and put him through all of her psychological tests, trying to find a bride for him. Did this mean she'd actually found him a bride who was willing to live through 9 months of winter every year? Was that even possible? He opened the letter and his eyes widened. His bride would be there to marry him on July 31st. They'd be married in a little church in Healy, which was a short drive from the park entrance. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of woman was willing to give up her entire world, travel to Alaska, and marry a stranger. He folded up the letter and put it on his coffee table. July 31st only gave him about 3 weeks to get ready. He looked around his cabin. First things first. He needed to clean the place and make it look like humans lived there and not bears. Every minute of every day seemed to be scheduled. Beverly was due to fly out of JFK Airport on July 29. She would then buy a car in Fairbanks, Alaska from the proceeds of the house, which had sold within 3 weeks, and she had to be out on the 28th, which was just fine. That would give her a couple of days to buy some more winter clothes. She'd rarely had a chance to leave the house, so 2 or 3 days' worth of winter wear were all she had. As she left her home for the last time, she felt only excitement, not dread. She was sure she'd be sad leaving the only home she'd ever known, but she knew it was time. A new family would live there and cherish her home in a way she never would again. Her childhood memories were good, and there had been some fun times with her mother. But mostly the house meant broken dreams to her. And no one wanted to dwell on broken dreams. She picked up her 2 suitcases, which represented everything she hadn't shipped ahead, and she slipped into the back of the cab. A lone tear slipped down her face as she left her childhood home and the only life she'd ever known. Beverly sat at the airport, waiting for her flight. It was supposed to start boarding in 45 minutes, but she'd been sure to be early. She couldn't miss this flight, which would take her to her new home and new life, thousands of miles away. She looked up to see Lachele approaching her, and the older woman sat down beside her, her purple hair blending right in at the airport. Are you ready? Beverly took a deep breath, nodding. I don't have a choice. I thought you were going to fly up in another day or 2. I decided it would be fun to be together for the flight. Don't you think? I do. Beverly had gotten to know Dr. Lachele much better since her mother's death. She'd come and put in a lot of hours packing to help her. And she'd done a touch of grief counseling, but it had been informal. Good. We'll land in Fairbanks tonight, and then buy a car tomorrow. And then we'll drive on up to Healy on Sunday. I've only been once, and it was gorgeous. I can't wait for you to see it. Beverly couldn't believe how very excited she was to go to a new state and start her life over again. A place where she wouldn't be the rich girl she'd been in school, but she also wouldn't be the poor girl who had spent the last 20 years taking care of her mother. No, she'd be Beverly, the woman who ran a foundation. She'd be a strong, independent woman, and no one would remember her any other way. I'm excited. I'm ready to start a new life. I'm sure you are. Just remember, you have to still be Beverly. Yes, it'll be a new world, where no one will remember you, but it will still be a world where all the things that have happened in your past will be part of you. Never discount the heartaches of the past, because they've made you who you are. Lachele spoke softly, but urgently. She needed Beverly to understand. I will. I promise. Beverly glanced down at her phone. We're boarding in 15 minutes. I sure hope this mystery man you have me marrying will be everything you've said he'll be. Oh, I promise, he will. He's a good man. I spent a day with him as well, you know. Beverly nodded, taking a deep breath. The idea of moving to Alaska was a wonderful one for her. The idea of doing something different with her life and starting over. However, the idea of marrying an absolute stranger who may or may not grow to love her was absolutely terrifying. I sure hope he's everything I need him to be. Of course, she had no real expectations. She hadn't been lying when she said she'd given up all her dreams of marriage and family many years before. I think you'll find him what you need. Maybe when you first meet him, he won't be everything you want him to be, but he'll be what you need. There's a reason I made you sign a contract to stay with him for a full year. It might take you that long to get used to him, and to realize he's the right man for you. Beverly took a deep breath as their flight was called. She put the strap of her carry-on over her shoulder and stood up. It was now or never. Chapter 2. After landing in Fairbanks, Lachele and Beverly checked into a couple of rooms at the Fairbanks Best Western there in Fairbanks. They took the airport shuttle and planned to take a cab to a Jeep dealership the next day. It had been a very long day, and they were both exhausted. Beverly decided to go to bed without eating, because the idea of picking up a fork was simply too much work. Lachele went to supper there at the hotel without her, and they agreed to meet at 10 the following morning to look at vehicles. The dealership opened at 10, and she wanted to be ready to hop in whichever car she chose and practice driving around town, before it was time to head toward Healy, the town Lachele had told her she would marry in. She fell straight to sleep and didn't move until her alarm woke her at 9 the following morning. She knew she needed food, but she didn't really have time to get any. She showered quickly and found a snack in a vending machine, and met Lachele in the lobby as promised. They could get the car and come back to the hotel for one more night. The drive to Fairbanks was only about 60 miles, and they could make that quickly if the road conditions were good. More than anything, she wanted to get the vehicle today, so she could practice driving. It had been years since she'd driven. She had a license that she'd kept up, but she hadn't gotten behind the wheel of a car since the night of the accident. Dr. Lachele was waiting for her in the lobby, a cup of coffee in her hand. Today's one of those days where I just need 4 of this stuff. Beverly grinned. I'm not usually a coffee drinker, but I'd taken 4 right about now myself. Are you ready to go car shopping? Beverly nodded. I'm a little nervous. It's been a really long time since I've driven. I kept my license up, because I always figured I wanted to be able to drive if I needed to. Well, we'll go look and see what we can find. There's a Jeep dealership here in town. I think that might be smart for you, because of the snow. You do know that Alaska gets its fair share of snow, right? Beverly grinned. I've heard that rumored somewhere. You mean it's true? Lachele cackled loudly as she linked her arm with Beverly's. Girl, there's so much I need to teach you. 10 minutes later, they were in a cab on their way to the Jeep dealership there in Fairbanks. I don't know that I want a Jeep. I want a real roof. I figured a good SUV would work for you. Beverly frowned. I guess. Aren't they really big? Lachele sighed. Let's go look at them. They drove 3 vehicles, Lachele always in the passenger seat, before they chose the one they wanted. It was a Jeep Grand Cherokee, and it was made for high altitudes. That sounded exactly like what Beverly needed. They spent a few minutes with the salesman, and Beverly paid for the whole amount. The salesman called her bank to verify the funds were actually there, but a few minutes later, she drove off the proud owner of a new vehicle. It was hard for her to get the hang of driving, and she was thankful that Fairbanks wasn't a busy city. When she'd parked at the hotel, she looked at Lachele. Do you think I should get a few more winter clothes here? I got lots in Manhattan, but I think what I got were winter clothes that will make me look good. I'm not sure how serviceable they are. Then let's go shopping. We'll get some lunch, and we'll get you ready for an Alaskan winter. Which I'm told will start in September. All right. Let's make it happen. Beverly backed out of the parking space she was in and headed back to town. She refused to let herself think about the impending winter. She was going to love living in Alaska. Period. Monday morning, Colin stood in a small room at the back of the Healy Church, wishing the morning would slip by faster. He had 30 minutes to go before the wedding, and that crazy Dr. Lachele had told him to be at the church an hour before the wedding, so she could meet with him. She'd brought him a bride, wasn't her part of the whole process finished? Who'd ever heard of meeting at the altar anyway? When the door opened, and Dr. Lachele walked in, he stood up straighter. She reminded him of an aunt of his, who had always swatted at him with whatever was handy whenever he slouched. I'm surprised you came all the way for the wedding? Dr. Lachele shrugged. I've never missed the wedding of any of the people that I've matched. I think it's my job to be there and to make sure everything goes as smoothly as it can. He shrugged. It'll be fine. Who cares about the actual wedding, when it's the marriage that matters? He'd never thought he'd care to marry, but after over 20 years of long winters in Denali, he needed a companion. I think you'll find women care a great deal about the ceremony. Are you planning on taking her on a honeymoon? Nah. What better place is there to honeymoon than in a cabin at Denali National Park? I can show her moose and lots of other wildlife. I sure hope she's a country girl and knows what she's in for. Dr. Lachele grinned, her smile scaring him a little. I think you'll be pleased with her, country girl or not. She's going to be a good wife to you. Can I meet her now? It seems silly to keep us from each other when we're right here in this building together. He knew that it wasn't the way she worked, but he had to try. Not happening. You knew how I worked when you agreed for me to find your bride. Don't rock the boat now, Colin. Dr. Lachele crossed her arms over her huge chest. Colin shrugged. Whatever, just so I get to meet her soon. She'll be walking down the aisle toward you in a few minutes. Don't you worry about that at all. Sounds good. I'm going to head back over to make sure she's ready. She realized then that Beverly was her first bride who had no one with her for her wedding. Not a single relative or friend. Her years of solitude caring for her mother had left a mark on her. When Lachele slipped back into the room with Beverly, the bride was pacing back and forth. She had a huge bouquet of flowers to carry down the aisle, and she looked ready. The bouquet included peach-colored roses and eucalyptus. There were also some blue flowers she couldn't quite identify, but they were beautiful just the same. I'm not sure I can go through with this. Are you sure it's what my mother wanted? Positive. Now get over here and give me a booby bump. It'll make you feel better. Did you ever tell my mother you wanted to booby bump her? Beverly asked as she complied. She just couldn't imagine her straight-laced mother going in for a booby bump. Lachele laughed. Nope, I never did tell her that. She seemed like that type that would be offended by booby bumping, which is sad if you ask me. Why sad? Well, calling hugs booby bumping is a way to enjoy life. To laugh and live in the moment. I don't think your mother was ever able to do that. Not after your father died, for sure. No, she wasn't able to after my father died. Really, I don't think she ever did before he died either. Life was hard for her. Beverly felt sad that her mother had never just enjoyed herself. She'd have to learn to live for the moment so she could make up for what her mother had missed. Lachele took both of Beverly's hands in hers, inspecting her from head to toe. "I love your hair up that way. And your dress is perfect, though maybe a bit chilly for Alaska. It's summer, and I'm going to wear a summer wedding dress. It's beautiful. I just wish it had some sleeves on it." Beverly shrugged. "I don't need sleeves. I'll have my new husband to keep me warm." She had no idea how she felt about the wedding night. She'd always planned to wait until she was married before having sex, and she'd done it. But she was marrying a stranger, so how was that going to work for her? "Wait until you see him," Lachele fanned her face with her hand. "The man is just what you expect to see when you hear about a man living in the wilds of Alaska. I'll wait and form my own opinions." Beverly glanced in a mirror to make sure none of her hair had fallen from the elegant updo she'd found a stylist to do that morning. She hadn't been sure anyone would be willing in the tiny town. "Is it time yet? My hair is going to fall any minute." When she'd been younger, she had been used to dressing up and attempting to always look like a lady. With her mother's illness, she'd worn little other than jeans and t-shirts. It was hard to lift someone and help them into a wheelchair if you were in a dress. Lachele glanced at her watch. "Yup, it's time. You hide in here, and I'll send your groom to the front." "You've talked to him today? He's here? He didn't run out on you, if that's what you're asking. He's as anxious to meet you as you are to meet him." As Lachele left, Beverly wondered if she was really anxious to meet him or just anxious to have the day over with. She hated being the center of attention, and she wanted to be done with the whole wedding thing. Having no idea if there was a reception planned was making the day a bit harder too. When Lachele came back a minute later, she was standing with her hands on her stomach as she carefully took deep breaths. She was about to marry a total stranger. Had she lost her ever-loving mind? And worse yet, had her mother lost her mind? This had all been her idea. Beverly said a quick prayer that her mother would have peace, and she picked up her bouquet, enjoying the blend of flowers in it. She put it to her nose, taking a deep sniff. She could do this. She knew she could. Lachele motioned her forward, and she took deep, calming breaths. She wouldn't have a panic attack as she walked down the aisle. She would rather run from the building screaming than have a panic attack. As she reached the back of the sanctuary, she saw her future husband standing there, watching her. His eyes were dark, and he had a closely trimmed beard. His hair was a medium brown, and he wore a dark suit with a blue tie. He looked very out of place in his suit, and she couldn't help but wonder how often he wore one. Not nearly as often as she wore a dress, she thought, and she hadn't worn a dress in years. As she slowly walked to the front of the church, she felt his eyes as well as the eyes of the small group of people gathered in the church watching her. One foot in front of the other. "You can do this." Her constant pep talks to herself were paying off. She was only a few feet from her future husband, and she didn't even know his name. She stopped walking just a foot from him, wondering if she was supposed to step up onto the step with him and take his hand. This was why people had wedding rehearsals, she told herself. This moment of confusion shouldn't be happening. He took the step toward her, offering his hand, and she gratefully put her hand in his. Her calloused hand that had done more chores than it had ever meant to do. She wondered if he thought it was too callous to touch, or if he didn't mind it. Either way, his hand swallowed hers, and she felt small and delicate beside him. Why did she have such a strong urge to bury her face in his shoulder? She was taller than most women she knew, but he towered over her. She liked that her head didn't come up much past his shoulder. The man must be 6.5 feet tall, which made her feel protected. She shook her head. No, she was obviously losing her mind. When the preacher started talking, she took a step closer to him, wondering what his name was. Would the pastor get mad if she asked her future husband his name? Or should she just stand there wondering, what was the right thing to do in the ridiculous situation she'd found herself in? She didn't have to wonder long. Her groom pressed his lips against her ear and whispered, "My name is Colin." Just that light touch sent shudders of heat through her body, making her wonder where this man had been all her life. Why hadn't he ridden in on a big white horse to carry her off into the sunset? "I'm Beverly," she whispered back, receiving a bit of a glare from the pastor. She'd be quiet until she was supposed to talk now. She just had to get the introductions out of the way. After they had repeated their vows, the pastor said, "You may now kiss your bride." Colin turned to her, catching her waist in his hands, and pulling her toward him. "I've been thinking about nothing but kissing you since the first moment I laid eyes on you," he whispered, lowering his lips to hers and kissing her. She'd expected a quiet church kiss, but instead, he gathered her close and kissed her passionately, his tongue stroking along her bottom lip. She put her arms around his shoulders and clung to him, enjoying the kiss more than she should. People were watching them, people she had never met, but whom she would be spending the rest of her life around. She pulled back, looking up at him. Her lips were moist from the kiss, and she could see his were too. She didn't know what to say, so she just stared at him. Wow. How am I going to be able to keep my head on my shoulders with him around? "Let's go to the back and talk for a minute," he whispered. Dr. Lachele had told him that was normal for a couple who was meeting for the first time at the altar. They went to the back room and talked to get to know one another a little better before they started being around other people. She nodded, willing to follow him anywhere. Slipping her hand into his, she followed him to the back of the church, to a little room beside the bride's room she'd used. He closed the door behind them, turning toward her. "Before we talk, I need to do one thing." Taking the bouquet of flowers from her hand, he set it onto a chair and pulled her toward him again. This time his kiss was a great deal more aggressive, and he pulled her completely against him. She wrapped her arms around him and clung for dear life. She'd been kissed many times, because she'd had a boyfriend who she was serious with in high school, but never had she been kissed like this. He kissed her as if he was a starving man, and she was the only sustenance he'd had for days. Finally, he raised his head. "If we keep that up, I'm not going to be able to go out and talk to people and thank them for coming to our wedding." When she understood his meaning, she blushed. "Let's sit." She led him to two chairs that were close together, and gave him her full attention. "First of all, what do you do?" He sat beside her, keeping one of her hands in his. He wasn't going to give up physical contact with her anytime soon. "I'm a park ranger at Denali National Park. I live in a cabin on the grounds year-round." "That sounds interesting. Do you like it?" "I sure hope so. I've been doing it for more than 20 years. Cabin's big enough for two, so you'll be moving in there with me. How about you? What do you do?" She frowned at the question. "I actually started a non-profit foundation to make baby quilts and afghans for babies who are born addicted to drugs and alcohol. I've done that for almost 20 years. He looked at her with surprise. "You can make a living at that?" Beverly shook her head. "No, I can't. I made a small salary, but I've also been caring for my mother. My father and sister were killed in a car wreck when I was 18. My mother was left a quadriplegic. I nursed her." She'd told the story 100 times, but this time she felt distanced from it. Maybe starting a new life really was the answer to her troubles. "That sounds rough. I'm sorry about your father and sister. Who's taking care of your mother now?" He couldn't imagine nursing someone for 20 years and then leaving them. How could she have done that? "My mother died 2 months ago. She had pneumonia. I wanted to take her to the hospital, but she knew another bout of pneumonia would kill her. She wanted to die with dignity at home, rather than be hooked up to a bunch of machines. I granted her dying wish." Well, and the one that said she wanted her to marry a man of Lachele's choosing too. There was time enough to tell him that later, though. They had a lifetime together after all. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing it softly. "I'm sorry you lost her. Are you completely alone now?" She shook her head. "No, I have you." Chapter 3. They went out to join their guests for a short while. Lachele had ordered a wedding cake, because she realized neither the bride nor the groom would think to. There was little other than the cake at the reception, and that was fine with both Beverly and Colin. Neither was all that interested in sticking around and hanging out with their guests. They were ready to be alone, which surprised Beverly a great deal. Every time her eyes met Colin's, she'd feel a frisson of heat climb up her spine. Every time their hands brushed, she'd want to stop what she was doing to kiss him. Lachele had been right. He was exactly the kind of rugged wilderness man she thought of when she thought of Alaska. And she was ready to have him all to herself. When they finally broke away from the others, she walked to her SUV, and he walked to his pickup truck. He stopped, realizing she wasn't beside him. "Does that thing have four-wheel drive?" She nodded. "It does." "Is it specially geared for high altitudes?" "Of course." He frowned. He'd almost hoped she'd say no, so he could insist she not drive much through the winter. "Follow me then." She drove the 12 miles south, following him, to the park entrance. Once they were both inside and on their way, she enjoyed the scenery. The pace in the park seemed very slow to her, but she supposed the tourists were trying to see the animals as best they could. She vowed to herself she'd never take the beauty surrounding her for granted. Once they reached his cabin, she got out, walking to the front door. He hadn't locked it, which surprised her a bit, until she remembered where they were. This little cabin was a far cry from her home in Manhattan, but she'd never tell him that. As far as she was concerned, this place was her home for the rest of her life. He led her into the house, showing her the room slowly. "This is the main room. The wood-burning stove is the primary source of heat. I have a gas furnace for when it gets really cold, but I prefer to use the stove." The room was cozy. It had quilts lying over the back of the couch and chair. She wondered if she'd be allowed to make a few changes. She liked the idea of it being her quilts on the back of the furniture. The art on the wall seemed to be paintings of the park, and she couldn't help but wonder who the artist was. He led her to the kitchen, where there was a small table for eating, a stove, sink, refrigerator, and microwave. It was nothing fancy, but it had what she'd need to feed them. She suspected she would be the one feeding them all the time. "Do you cook?" He shrugged. "When it's the only answer to starving. I'm not a fan, but I can make do in a pinch." Canned beans and beef stew had been his staples through the winter for a lot of years. Since he'd lived alone there for 20 years or more, he must have had a lot of pinches. "I enjoy cooking." "Good. Someone needs to. Nearest place to shop for groceries is Fairbanks. We can drive there tomorrow, if you want. I took the week off work, so we can get to know each other." He seemed to think that taking the time off work had been a special favor to her, and she hoped he wouldn't always think that his time was a precious gift he was giving her. That would be nice. She wanted to check out the stores around them, so she could have an idea of what she was dealing with. She had a feeling that using Amazon Prime would be very different out here in the wilderness. Same-day shipping was a thing of the past for certain. He led her to another room, and she realized quickly it was a spare room. She had moved from a 13-bedroom mansion to a 2-bedroom cabin. Life was changing faster than she could keep up with at the moment. "This is where I store stuff for the winter. There are times when we're snowed in here for a few weeks at a time, so I make sure I'm always prepared for at least 3 months." He lifted the edge of the quilt to show her the food that was stored under the bed. Many cans of beans. She hoped he was all right with the changes she planned to make to his eating. There was a freezer against one wall that she assumed he used for his winter food storage as well. She opened it to see a couple of packages of ground beef, but nothing else. She'd have to plan to fill that soon. There in a small room beside the spare bedroom was a washer and dryer. She breathed a sigh of relief, thrilled she wouldn't have to go all the way into town to do laundry. He led her the other way, down a short hall, and showed her the bathroom to the right. It was a small, serviceable room. There was no tub, and just a shower, and she knew she'd be kissing her baths goodbye. She'd just started taking them again after her mother died, and now they'd be gone again. Small. He shrugged. Only one person uses it at a time. It's big enough for that. Across the short hall was another bedroom. This time, the bed was obviously used. She could tell because of how sloppily it was made. "This is our room." She bit her lip at the idea of sharing the big bed with him. It's a nice room. He nodded. Feel free to make any changes you want. Don't get rid of my bed, but it's fine to put a different quilt on it. All right. Thank you. He rubbed the back of his neck, seeming a bit nervous himself. Why don't I bring your suitcases in? You wander around and look at everything, and think about all the changes you're going to make. I won't change that much. He shrugged. I really don't care how much you change. It's a bachelor cabin now, but I think you'll enjoy it more when it's decorated to your taste. She looked around her at the sparse furnishings. She could add some homemade pillows and quilts. Everything would look a lot better when she was done. And he'd said it was all right. You're right. There are changes I want to make. Colin grinned. Good girl. Make it your own. You're going to be living here with me. No point in not loving it just as much as you can. He left and shut the front door as he went to get her suitcases. Beverly stood for a moment, wondering what she should do. It was such a strange situation to be in that she was very confused. Nowhere in her upbringing had she been taught the right way to act when you marry a man you've never met before. She went to the kitchen to take inventory. She had a feeling he expected her to cook that first night. She dug through the refrigerator and freezer, immediately making a shopping list on her cell phone. She needed to know what she'd be buying the following day when she went to the store with him. She pulled some chicken breasts out of the freezer, found some rice in a cabinet, and immediately searched for spices. She could make something tasty out of those ingredients if she just had a few spices. She didn't find much and immediately added more spices to her shopping list. She could make do with what she had, though. There had been plenty of time for practice while her mother was ill and the funds were short. Beverly thought briefly about the money she had in her bank back in Manhattan and decided not to mention it just yet. She didn't know if he was the kind of man who would run through her money, or if he gambled or drank his money away. She would have to get to know him before she could truly trust him. She knew she should automatically trust Lachele not to have married her to someone like that, but it was hard. Colin came into the cabin carrying her 2 suitcases, a pillow, and an afghan. I do have pillows and blankets here. I figured you would. Those are special. I've had that pillow since I was a little girl, and the afghan is the first one I learned to make after the accident. She took them from him, hurrying into the bedroom they'd share. Unpacking her suitcases, she hung most of the things, and put some in the 2 drawers he'd cleaned out for her. The clothes that I purchased in Fairbanks when I first arrived will be shipped here. Lachele wouldn't give me your address, so it was a comedy of errors to get her to give it to the salespeople. Did you buy a lot? He eyed the clothes she was unpacking and putting away, and he had no idea how she was going to be able to make it through the winter with them. He hoped she'd been more practical when she'd shopped in Fairbanks. Beverly shrugged. I bought the stuff the saleswoman suggested. Lots of winter clothes. I had Manhattan winter clothes, but not many, so I bought a lot before I left. I think it was a mistake, because those clothes were meant to make me look good in the winter, not to help me keep warm. Colin smiled. I was thinking that while you were unpacking. I was getting a bit worried we'd have to make another drive into the city, so we could get you some decent winter clothes. He shook his head. After all these years of living in Denali, the idea of going to a city as big as Fairbanks is overwhelming. She grinned. Fairbanks? Big? I moved here from New York City. Fairbanks seemed like a tiny place to me. Small? Fairbanks is about 32,000 people. That's big by my standards. Beverly shrugged. New York is 8.5 million. That's a city. Are you going to miss being able to shop and eat out all the time? I haven't been able to do that for years. Money's been too tight since my father died. It was all I could do to keep us from going bankrupt. She continued unpacking, preferring not to discuss how difficult life had been for her. He frowned, watching her. You seem like someone who comes from money. She shrugged. We had money when I was a girl. After the accident, money was tight. Mom's hospital bills were outrageous. He didn't like to think of her scrimping and saving. I make a decent salary here. Nothing big, but you won't have to worry about where your next meal will come from. I can see we'll be living simply, and that suits me fine. She put the last of her things away. I found some things I can throw together for supper. Are you hungry? He glanced at the clock on the wall. With as late as the sun set at this time of year, there was no telling what time it was by the sun. I'm getting there. I could take you out for supper tonight. It is our wedding night. I don't mind cooking. I'll make something tonight, and you can take me out for lunch tomorrow, before we go grocery shopping. Beverly went into the kitchen, moving efficiently. You'll have to give me an idea of what foods you like, or I'll just be cooking what I like. You might be disappointed. I like lots of meat and potatoes. I'll eat green stuff, but just to stay healthy, it doesn't make me happy to eat it. She smiled at that. I will keep that in mind. As she preheated the oven and started the rice cooking, he stood watching her. You can go sit and watch television or something if you'd like. I can do this myself. I'd rather watch you cook. She blushed at that. I promise I won't break into song or dance. I'm just going to put together a few things, so we have a meal tonight. I don't expect song and dance. As Colin watched her cook, it occurred to him that she had no idea just how beautiful she was. That wasn't a bad thing for him, but maybe it was for her. Why did you decide to contact Dr. Lachele? Beverly thought about what she'd say for a moment, trying her best to not sound like she'd been coerced into anything. Lachele was a good friend of my mom's. One of the last things Mom said to me was that she wanted me to talk to Lachele after she died. I thought she wanted me to be counseled by her, but Lachele knew differently. She approached me at the funeral and asked me to meet with her. When I did, she explained about matrimony. I had never even heard of it. So did you agree to marry me for you, or for your mother? Colin was surprised at how much her answer mattered to him. He held his breath as he waited for a response. I have to honestly say that it was a bit of both. I was at loose ends without Mom to take care of, but I don't know if I'd have come here without her nudging me. I will make the best out of our situation, and I'm glad I'm here, but would I have done it without Mom's encouragement? Probably not. He frowned. I don't want to be married to someone who doesn't want to be married to me. Beverly shook her head. That's not what I'm saying though. I'm happy to be married to you. I made this choice, and I'm glad I did. I don't know that I would have ever discovered what Lachele did with matrimony if I hadn't been nudged in that direction by my mother, though. Does that make any sense? He shrugged. I guess so. It made some sense, but he didn't like it. He liked the idea that she'd flown there of her own free will to marry a stranger. I'm sorry if that wasn't the answer you wanted. I try my best to always be honest, even if the truth hurts. Colin nodded. All right, I appreciate the honesty then. He watched her as she began mixing the ingredients she'd made in different places into one dish. It didn't look fabulous, but it sure smelled good. I'm glad you can cook. She grinned at him. I didn't learn to cook until after the accident. I had to let the cook go, along with the maids. I needed to eat, so I taught myself to cook out of necessity. I ate a few burnt meals that first year, but I made it through. I'm happy to benefit from your errors. She shook her head at him. It's time to eat. Would you mind getting a couple of plates down for me? She'd found the silverware in her search, but she had yet to find the plates. She assumed they were in one of the high cabinets, but she'd had no time to check for them yet. Sure enough, he reached above her head and took down 2 plates with a simple pattern on them. Anything else? She shook her head, carefully putting some of the casserole she'd made onto each of the plates. Thanks for the help. Handing him one of the plates full of food and a fork, she took her own to the table. Is water all right with supper, or do you prefer something else? Water's fine. We have really good water here, too. The last time I went into a city, I couldn't even drink the water, it tasted so bad. She filled 2 glasses of water from the faucet before joining him at the table. Well, I'm sure I'll prefer it to Manhattan's water. I couldn't drink that at all. Thankfully we had a water filtration system that made it better. I can't imagine what the cost would have been if we'd had to continually buy bottled water. He ate several bites of his meal. This is wonderful. She smiled. It's just something I threw together. I probably couldn't mimic it if I tried. I'm surprised you don't want kids, he said finally, after polishing off half of his meal. You seem like the type that would love them. She shrugged. I've had female problems for years. The doctor told me I'd never be able to have kids, so it wasn't a big deal to agree to that stipulation. She was even past wanting children, mostly. I'd say I'm sorry, but I'm not. I can't imagine having kids at my age, and I'm glad you don't want them. He was 43, and the idea of kids just made his skin crawl. He was too old, and he'd never been particularly fond of kids anyway. Well, it's not a problem. We will be too old for kids together. He eyed her, frowning. How old are you? You don't look too old for kids. I'm 38. Maybe that's not technically too old for kids, but it feels like it is. I can understand that. Once you reach a certain age, I think your desire for children, if you ever had one, goes right out the window. I know I've never really had one, which is part of the reason I never married. The other part was that I don't meet a lot of single women. Denali is a place that families and married people come. Not single women looking for park rangers. She grinned. Maybe you should have taken to riding around on a white horse, trying to rescue women from the stupid things I know they must do. Colin shook his head at her. Most of the stupid things they do are too dangerous to be rescued from. No, I think I'm glad I left my white horse in Wisconsin. Are you from Wisconsin? She was surprised, because she hadn't noticed a Midwestern accent at all. He nodded. Farm boy born and bred. I think that's part of the reason I ended up here. I loved the outdoors, and wanted more places to be like the woods near my family's house. Here, that's what I get. Well, I'm glad you're here. She reached out and tucked her hand into his. I'm glad we're married. Chapter 4. After the dishes were done, Beverly joined Colin in the living room, sitting beside him on the couch, but leaving a full cushion between them. She wasn't sure how she felt about sitting close. Well, yes she was. She felt breathless and excited and nervous all at once. It was strange just how many emotions the man brought out in her. He was watching something on television, something she didn't recognize. She hadn't really watched TV in years, so that wasn't at all surprising. He patted the spot next to him, lifting up the edge of a quilt he was sitting under. She scooted toward him, careful not to touch him. She liked touching him a little too much, for her peace of mind. His arm slipped around her, and she melted into him. What are you watching? I have no idea. I was waiting for you to join me here. He kissed her forehead, his hand going to the remote to switch the TV off. What shows do you watch? I don't. I've been so wrapped up in taking care of my mother for so long, that everything else in life has taken a back seat. I've spent the last 6 weeks packing up a house my family has lived in for over 40 years. There were so many things that were never gone through after my father and younger sister died, and then I had to go through Mom's things too. If Lachele hadn't helped, I'd probably still be there. I didn't know you had to go through all that. Did you finish? She nodded. I donated most of the things the family had saved up. I even found the crib I used. It was strange, but Mom seemed to keep absolutely everything. I'm sure that was very painful for you, going through all those old things. Beverly made a face. You'd think it would have been, but I actually enjoyed the memories. I kept some things, but donated so much. We'll have a UPS shipment soon of lots and lots of boxes. Lachele addressed them all, because I wasn't allowed to know where I was going. Colin shook his head. I'm not sure what we're going to do with a whole lot of stuff. I don't exactly have a lot of room here. She shrugged. If I have to, I'll get a storage unit in town. There were just some things I couldn't part with. Maybe in a year or two, I'll feel differently. Alright. I think it might be smarter to get rid of him now, but you can decide to do things how you want. He loved that she was willing to solve her own problems. She turned more fully toward him. I'm pretty nervous about tonight, she said, changing the subject. I've never. He shrugged. I haven't either. I guess we'll figure it out together. Tonight? She didn't know if she wanted to wait or just get it over with. I'd prefer tonight. I've been looking at you all day, being close to you. I'm definitely attracted to you, and you're my wife. I can't think of a good reason to wait. Beverly studied him for a moment before nodding. You're right. If we waited, I'd just get more and more nervous. It's like ripping off a band-aid, right? I sure hope not. I'm expecting it to be a great deal more pleasurable than that. She grinned. I hope you're right. I have no real expectations. Not this first time anyway. He pulled her closer to him, lowering his lips to hers. If she was going to be nervous and analyze everything to death, maybe it was better if they just got to the good stuff right away. As Colin's lips toyed with hers, she gave a tiny moan of pleasure, wrapping her arms around him. When he kissed her like this, her whole body was on fire. It felt so good to have him touching her and kissing her. He got to his feet and scooped her up in his arms, carrying her into the bedroom and setting her on the bed. He shut the door behind him, determined that they would make it through this first time and enjoy it. Both of them. When Beverly woke the following morning, she tried to roll to her side, but her hair was trapped under a heavy weight. She tried to pull it out, but encountered a hairy, muscular arm. Her eyes widened. No wonder she was sore in places she didn't want to think about. She was married. She freed her hair and turned toward him, smiling as she studied his face in sleep. He looked so much younger with his face completely relaxed, and he seemed to be sleeping with a slight smile on his face. She liked to think the smile was due to her, but she couldn't prove it. She remembered she wasn't wearing anything, and decided to slip into the bathroom before he woke up. Not that she had anything he hadn't already seen. She grabbed clean clothes and slipped across the hall, taking a long hot shower. After her shower, Beverly hurried into the kitchen, hoping she could find food to cook for breakfast. He had a lot of cans of various things, but there was little she could actually cook with. His idea of cooking was obviously warming things up in his microwave. She found some bacon at the back of the fridge and checked the expiration date, breathing a sigh of relief. She had a whole 2 days before it expired. There were only 2 eggs in the whole fridge, but she found some bread and a tiny bit of milk left in a gallon jug. After searching through the cabinets, she discovered some maple syrup. Perfect. She'd make French toast for breakfast, and she could buy what she needed in town later. By the time she was finished cooking, Colin wandered into the kitchen wearing just a pair of boxers. She blushed for a moment, but went on, setting the table and serving breakfast. When she was seated at the table with him, he took her hand and said a short prayer. This smells delicious, he told her with a yawn. It's just French toast. Super simple to make. For you, maybe. I tried once and had a huge mess that smelled to high heaven. I'm glad there's someone here who can actually cook now. Are you still willing to take me to town later? I want to get the grocery shopping done early in the day. I've made a list on my phone. Yeah, as soon as you're ready, I'll take you. Do you just want groceries? Or do you want to explore a little? I wouldn't say no to exploring. I love the idea of learning about my new home. She ate a bite of her bacon, smiling a bit. She didn't know what it was about bacon, but it always made her taste buds jump up and sing. Sounds good. There's a lot to do in Healy in the summer. We're going to have to drive to Fairbanks to get groceries, but for the rest of the week, we'll find fun stuff to do. I'd love to take you on an ATV ride, and show you the parts the tourists don't see much. We could do some of the touristy stuff too and take a boat tour or a raft. I could also just drive you through Denali so you could see some of the wildlife. There are places we can hike as well, if you enjoy hiking. I haven't been hiking in a really long time, but I wouldn't mind giving it a try. And I love the idea of going on a raft. Maybe not today, but later this week. I think we should get the food situation taken care of, and then I can start worrying about what I want to do this week. I love being in the water, and I used to love walking, but there just hasn't been time. Well, we'll conquer the food today. Then tomorrow we can go on a rafting trip. Maybe we can do some hiking on Thursday. I don't have to work again until Monday, so I would love to show you my world. Someday we'll have to fly to New York for a week, and I'll show you my world. He frowned. I have this strange feeling that I would hate your world. I hope you don't feel that way about mine. She moved her hand to cover his on the table. I already love your world. I'm not going to hate it. Ever. I hope you still feel that way after winter. Our winters last 9 months here, and they are not for the weak of heart. I'm sure all will be fine. She looked at him for a moment. And do you know why? He shook his head. No, why? Beverly smiled. Because there's nothing weak about me. Colin grinned. You know? I believe that. A short while later, they were in his truck on their way to Fairbanks. It's crazy to me you have to drive so far for groceries here. We had them delivered in Manhattan. He laughed. We're a far cry from Manhattan. There are places closer to buy snacks. There are places to buy all kinds of liquor. But if we want real groceries, a trip to Fairbanks is the answer. You learn fast here that if you're going to the store, you should ask all your neighbors if they need something, so they'll return the favor down the road. So did you ask the neighbors before we left? She asked, very curious. He shook his head. Not this time. I figured I'd get a pass, because I'm on my honeymoon. Everyone deserves a honeymoon pass. I guess you're right. She stared out the window, loving the views. What river is that? The Nenana. Healy is in the Nenana River Valley. Such a beautiful area. I don't think I'll ever get sick of just looking around. How far are we from North Pole, Alaska? I've heard stories about it all my life. I'm really into Christmas. It had been hard to keep her spirits up through the holiday season for many years, but now she was starting over. Maybe there would be a way for her to give back this holiday season. Glancing at her new husband, she felt she had a lot to be thankful for. Colin smiled. We'll be very close to North Pole. Do you want to go there? It's a lot of fun. Yes, please. We'll do that before we get groceries then. There's even a little fudge shop inside the main store there. Beverly grinned at him. Fudge? You're talking my language. He laughed. You seem like the type to be a chocolate worshipper. Oh, I am. I promise you that. If you ever need to apologize to me, skip the flowers and bring me boxes of chocolate. Are you supposed to give me clues like that so early in our marriage? Shouldn't you wait a little while before telling me all your deep dark secrets? She shook her head. Nope. We're married. You need to know the right way to apologize. Flowers would be a major faux pas. I'll keep that in mind. When he pulled into North Pole, she was watching around them like a child in a candy store. The street lights look like candy canes. They sure do. He hadn't been to North Pole in a lot of years, but he was enjoying her excitement a great deal. Finally, they reached the Santa Claus house, and she hurriedly jumped out of the car. She sat on a sleigh, smiling at Colin as he took her picture, before wandering along the outside of the house. There were pictures painted along the walls, all of Christmas scenes. I want to come here every time we go to Fairbanks for groceries. He laughed. I'm not sure that's going to be possible, but we can come sometimes. He took her hand, leading her to the door. Wait until you see the inside. She walked in with wide eyes, staring at all the beautiful ornaments and Christmas decorations. As she walked through the store, she picked up several things, carrying them to the checkout counter. You should go get us fudge, she said over her shoulder to Colin. What kind? Surprise me. Get a variety, all right. He wasn't sure a variety was the best idea in the world, but if it was what she wanted, he'd do it. He found he was already willing to do just about anything that would bring a smile to her face. She paid for her purchases, and he brought her a bag of fudge, handing her the lighter bag and carrying the heavier one. Our house is going to look like Santa Claus puked in a few months, isn't it? Oh yeah. You're going to love it. She couldn't wait for the holiday season to start. There was no doubt they'd have a white Christmas. After he loaded up the car, they drove into Fairbanks. Any idea what you want for lunch? She shrugged. What's here? Do you want fancy or casual? I really don't have a preference. Just something yummy. There's a place in a small mall that does crepes. I've been there a few times, and I think it would be something you'd like. So they have savory as well as sweet? She didn't want to be locked into a lunch that was just sweet when she had fudge waiting for her. Yes, they do. Want to try it? Sure, sounds like fun. He pulled into a parking lot near a small mall, and she jumped down from the truck. They held hands as they walked into the mall, and he led her to the crepe shop. Worst thing about this place is you have to get a key to use the bathroom, and it's all the way around the corner. That sounds like a pain. I hope the food is worth it. It really is. They ordered. He got a ham and cheese crepe, so she followed suit. She'd never had a savory crepe before, so she trusted his judgment. They sat on some stools facing a wall. As soon as she'd taken a bite of the crepe, she sighed. These are delicious. And now I need to learn how to make crepes. Do you think you could? He nodded to where the employees were making the crepes right in front of them. I do think so. It's just a matter of getting a recipe. Now that I've seen it done, I'll have a better idea of how to do it at home. They watched them long after they'd finished their meal. Do you want a dessert crepe? He asked. We could split one. She shook her head. I'm stuffed, but we'll be sure to come back here and have them again. They got back into the truck and drove to the grocery store. The store he chose was huge, much bigger than the grocery stores she'd been to in Manhattan. They each got a shopping cart and stocked up. She bought enough to completely fill up his extra freezer as well as non-perishables. I can cook for a while on this. He nodded. We'll still make another trip in a month. We want to make sure we have a good stock of food before the first snows fall. He loaded the bags of groceries into the truck before getting in and starting the engine. Is there anywhere I can buy crafting supplies here? I need some fabric and some more yarn. I want to keep making the quilts and afghans for the babies. So you don't just run your foundation, you make stuff too? Yeah, that's how it started. I was looking for something I could do from my mother's bedside. It was the perfect solution for me. Are you going to make some stuff for the house too? Absolutely, if you don't mind. I like the idea of having some things I've made on the back of the couch and hanging on some of the walls. Let's go then. He loaded all the groceries into the truck and drove the short distance to a craft store. Do I have to come in? She laughed, shaking her head. We wouldn't want them to take your man card away. You know about the man card? Women aren't supposed to know about that. Don't tell anyone. Colin looked around furtively, looking to be sure no one had heard. You're a bit messed up in the head, Beverly told him. You know that, don't you? I couldn't do my job if I wasn't. Chapter 5. By the 1st of October, there was a layer of snow on the ground. Beverly was thankful there were places close by where she could get a gallon of milk, and not have to drive all the way to Fairbanks for everything. Being married was so much more than she'd dreamed it would be. She had made the changes to the house she wanted to make, and she was happy to be there. She met a few local women, and some had even agreed to help her with her foundation. It was a Wednesday in the middle of October, and she had to run out to get milk and eggs. Everything else could wait for the weekend when she and Colin would drive into town together, but she didn't want to have to make the long drive alone. As she was walking through the convenience store, she felt a bit dizzy, which surprised her. She'd expected it when she first moved there, because the altitude was more than she was used to, but it hadn't happened then. Why would it happen now? She bought the eggs and milk, taking them to her vehicle and sitting there behind the wheel breathing deeply. What could be wrong with her? She had no idea, but she pulled out her cell phone and made a couple of calls, determined to find out. Hopefully she was just anemic or something. She'd done that before. She was surprised when the doctor got her right in. There had been a cancellation. Driving to the doctor's office, she parked beside the building and hurried inside. She filled out the paperwork and waited to be called back. She hadn't established care there yet, because she wasn't anywhere near needing her annual physical, so she hadn't worried about it. She was playing a game on her phone when the nurse came out to get her. Mrs. Geller? For a moment, she didn't even realize the woman was using her name. She'd been Miss Snow for so long that Mrs. Geller sounded foreign to her. She stood up and followed the nurse, putting her purse on the counter so she could be weighed. There was nothing more demoralizing than standing on a scale. She had never been overweight, but she still hated to step onto the scale. There was too much emphasis on a person's weight in the U.S. She followed the nurse into the room and had her vitals taken. What was the date of the first day of your last menstrual cycle? The question stumped Beverly. I think it was May. Right before my mother died, but I've never been regular. The nurse made notes on a chart, and then left the room. The doctor will be with you shortly. The doctor was a short little Asian woman, who was very no-nonsense. So you were dizzy today? That's why you're here. Yes. I've been dizzy before, but it was always because I was anemic. I expected some dizziness when I first moved here, but I've been here since the end of July. That seems like a long time for it to show up. Oh, it's definitely not the altitude. Dr. Young looked at the chart. What birth control method are you using? I'm not. I've always had problems with my cycles, and I had a doctor tell me several years ago that without surgical intervention, I wouldn't be able to have children. My husband isn't interested in children, so we're not going that route. The doctor frowned. Did your doctor tell you what was wrong with you? I have endometriosis. Beverly shrugged. It's never been a big deal to me, because until a few months ago, I was taking care of my invalid mother. I wasn't sure if I'd ever even marry. Do you mind if I do some blood work? Not at all. Do you know what's wrong? I have my suspicions, but I'm going to confirm them before I say anything. Beverly shrugged. That works. I'd also like a urine sample if you don't mind. Not at all. The doctor sent her into the bathroom with instructions for the urine sample. When she finished there, the nurse was waiting to take her blood. How long will it be before I get my results? Probably tomorrow. We do a lot of the lab work in-house, because we'd have to ship them so far. Beverly stood up, catching the counter. She was dizzy again. Hopefully there would be an answer and some medicine soon. The door opened, and the doctor came back in. Sit down, Mrs. Geller. Beverly frowned, but did as she was told. She'd been obedient to doctors for too long to stop now. It just happened again. I don't need to run any more tests. Your urine test told me everything I need to know. Oh? What's wrong with me? Absolutely nothing. Nothing? But why am I getting dizzy? You're expecting. I'll know better what your due date is when I get your blood test results. Beverly sat blinking for a minute. There's no way. I can't have children. Doctors make mistakes every day. You're definitely having a baby. We need to get you on some prenatal vitamins. The doctor kept talking, but Beverly sat in stunned silence. She was having a baby. She knew that Colin wouldn't be thrilled, but she was. She was more excited than she'd ever dreamed she'd be at that news. She stopped and had the prescription filled on her way back to the national park. As she drove, she couldn't stop thinking about the baby. She actually had a life growing inside her. She couldn't wait to hold the baby in her arms. All those years when she'd thought she was infertile and would never have a child disappeared. She was pregnant. She had no idea how she would tell Colin, because he'd made it clear on many occasions that children weren't in the cards for him. He didn't even like kids. She thought about telling him over dinner, but after some thought, she decided it might be good to wait a little while to tell him. When she got home, she started supper in the crock pot, thinking that a nap was in order. She hadn't had one in a long time, but she was tired. The doctor had encouraged her to sleep more, and she was going to do just that. She'd put in a lot of hours getting the house where she wanted it before winter, and now it was just a matter of keeping up with the daily tasks. She had a quilt she was making in Christmas colors, but she'd continue with that after her nap. When she woke a couple of hours later, she felt fully refreshed. She still didn't know how she was going to tell Colin about the baby, but maybe if she talked to him about children, he'd realize just how much he wanted them. This pregnancy had been an accident, but the child was anything but unwanted. As they ate dinner that evening, she asked, "What made you decide you didn't want children?" He put his fork down, looking at her with surprise. "I've never wanted kids. Now that I'm in my mid-40s, I can't imagine having a child to raise. I'd be in my 60s before he or she graduated from high school. That's way too old." She shrugged. "People do it every day. Why bring this up? I thought we were in agreement not to have children." "We were." She decided not to push the topic any further. Not just yet anyway. She'd find just the right time to tell him, and she was sure he'd be thrilled about the birth of his child. How could he not be? He was a caring man, and he seemed to care about her. Surely he'd understand that a child can come from a loving marriage. As she fell asleep that night, she had a smile on her lips. She was having a baby. All was right with the world. Beverly received a phone call from Dr. Young early the next morning, shortly after Colin had left for the day. "Hello? Mrs. Geller?" "Yes. This is Dr. Young. I'm calling to let you know the results of your blood tests. You are very definitely pregnant, but based on your HCG numbers, I'd say you are almost 3 months along." "Really? I was just married at the end of July. If you want to come back in, I can do an ultrasound. That will give us a more accurate reading." Beverly bit her lip. She needed to know when she would start showing. She had to find a way to tell Colin before then. "Yes, I will do that. Can you come in tomorrow at 10? "Absolutely. I'll see you then." After she'd hung up the phone, Beverly sat with her hand resting on her stomach. She could feel anything yet, but she knew there was a baby there. How could she possibly be sad about that? Beverly laid back on the table with a sheet covering her stomach, waiting for the doctor to come in. She was nervous and excited all at once. She was about to see her baby for the first time. After spending hours doing research the day before, she even had an idea of what the baby would look like. When the doctor joined her, she squirted some cold gel onto her stomach and ran the wand over her, pressing hard in places. Beverly wanted to complain that it hurt, but she knew better. Finding out that the baby was okay and how far along she was mattered a great deal more than her comfort. The doctor was measuring, explaining things as she went. "I'm doing measurements, because they'll tell us how far along you are. Usually we go by the last menstrual cycle, but with as irregular as yours have always been, we need a more accurate way to gauge." She paused to type a few numbers into her system. "There's definitely only one baby." Another long pause. "I would say you're 12 weeks along. You'll have a baby in about 28 weeks, which is a little less than 7 months. I'm going to say your due date is around May 1st. When will I start showing?" Beverly knew the question was an odd one, but she needed to know how long she had before she absolutely needed to tell Colin about the baby. Another month probably. The doctor wiped the gel off the wand and placed it in its slot at the front of the machine. "You're very small, so I think you're going to want to increase your calories if you can. Make sure you take regular naps. Get your vitamins in every day. How are you sleeping at night?" "I've been getting up a lot more than usual to use the bathroom. I didn't really put it together until just now, but I've been doing it for over a month." "That's normal. Are you experiencing any cramping?" Beverly shook her head. "No, not at all." "Good. I'll want to see you every month for the next few months, and we'll increase to weekly visits as you're nearing your time." The doctor held her hand down to help Beverly sit up. "Congratulations. Thank you. She wasn't sure congratulations were in order yet, but Beverly wasn't going to dismiss the words. Whether Colin was happy about this baby or not, she was, and she had a right to be. After thinking she'd never have children for a lot of years, it was time for her to celebrate the new life growing within her. When she got home, she started working on an Afghan for the baby. The doctor had told her it would be another month or two before they'd discover the sex of the baby, but she didn't care. She would be prepared either way. Thankfully Colin wouldn't notice anything amiss, because she was always making baby blankets of one kind or another. She started taking naps religiously, making sure she slept for at least an hour during the day. It was a little harder on the weekends, but Colin noticed how tired she was, and he encouraged her. "I'm a little worried you're getting sick." She shook her head. "Nah. I'm healthy as a horse. I think I just want to hibernate, because that's what all the bears are doing." He chuckled. "You sure have taken to living in Alaska better than I thought you would. Of course, it's only November, and we have another 6 months of winter ahead of us. You do know that for most of the world, winter only lasts 3 months, don't you? Wait until there's almost no sunlight for weeks on end. You're not going to know what to think." She leaned down and kissed him, wandering off to the bedroom for her nap. As she fell asleep, she smiled to herself. A baby was going to be there. As the weeks went by, she couldn't seem to find the exact right time to tell him about the baby. A week before Christmas, she went in for her monthly exam, and the doctor did another ultrasound. "You're having a girl." Knowing the sex of the baby made it so much more real to Beverly. She decided she had to tell Colin. Christmas would be the perfect time. He'd be in good spirits because of the holiday, and she would find a fun way to tell him. Surely he'd be as happy as she was. On Christmas morning, she woke early. She made a special breakfast casserole, planning to tell him over breakfast, before they even opened their gifts. Her mind was racing with possible baby girl names as she worked in the kitchen, a smile on her face. "You sure look happy this morning," Colin said from the kitchen doorway. She grinned at him. "It's Christmas, the most glorious day of the whole year. I guess I should have known the first time you insisted on visiting North Pole that you'd be thrilled with the holiday. That really should have been your first clue." They'd visited North Pole 4 times since her arrival. She couldn't get enough of Santa Claus's house. She waved her hand toward the table. "Sit. Breakfast is just about ready." He got them each a glass of orange juice, before sitting. He had noticed she didn't seem to drink coffee anymore, but he didn't mind. Maybe that's why she was always so tired. "So are we opening our gifts after breakfast?" He hadn't been able to miss the small mountain of presents under the tree. Of course, many were presents he'd purchased for her. It had been so long since he'd had someone to buy Christmas presents for that he'd almost been as excited as she was. He'd certainly gone all out for the holiday. "I thought that would be best. Are you okay with that?" In her mind, she was thinking about this being her last Christmas alone with him. Next year they'd have a beautiful little girl with dark hair and eyes, and she would be crawling most likely. Oh, how she wanted to see that little girl. He shrugged. "Sure. We can do things however you want. I'm just happy to have someone I love to share this Christmas with." She froze for a moment. He'd never said he loved her before, and she had been afraid to say the words first. Of course, she loved him, but to hear him say he loved her, well, it was like a dream come true. Now he would be just as happy about the baby as she was. He loved her after all. "Did you just say you love me? Have I never said that before?" He shook his head. "Surely I have." "No, you've never said it before. And I love you too." "Yeah, I know." He took a bite of his breakfast, nodding. "This is good. You should make it more often." "How do you know?" "You wouldn't take care of me the way you do if it was just out of obligation. You have to love me." Colin grinned at her look of exasperation. "Wasn't I supposed to know?" She shrugged. "I guess I always expected to be able to say the words and please you with them, instead of you just saying that you already know. Do you want me to pretend to be surprised?" 'Cause I can do that if you want. Beverly frowned at him. No, you don't have to pretend to be surprised. She shook her head. You sure do take the fun out of making grand statements though. He caught her hand and brought it to his lips. I'm thrilled that you love me, because I can't imagine spending the rest of my life with anyone else. The smile on her face told him that she was thrilled with his words, even if she wasn't thrilled that he wasn't surprised she loved him. I'm glad you like the casserole. It's a new recipe I found on the internet. I thought it would be special for Christmas morning. Does every minute of Christmas need to be special? He asked, teasing her. He knew how she felt about the holiday. Of course it does. It's our first Christmas together. And our only Christmas alone. She had to get up the courage to tell him about the baby. She knew that once he thought about it, he'd be as happy as she was. We'll have a whole lot more of them together, you know. I sure hope so. She blotted her mouth with her napkin, deciding to just spit it out. How bad could it be? I'm pregnant. Chapter 6. Colin stared at Beverly for a moment, in absolute disbelief. You what? The look on his face told Beverly she'd been wrong. He wasn't going to automatically love the baby. I'm pregnant. I found out last week that I'm having a little girl. His hands clenched under the table. Exactly how long have you known you were pregnant? Since mid-October. I kept waiting for the right time to tell you, but it never came. I'm already seeing huge differences in my body, so I couldn't hide it any longer. She frowned, feeling ready to cry at any moment. I'm sorry I didn't tell you right away. I just didn't know how. He forced himself to take deep breaths to keep his anger down. Have you talked to an adoption agency yet? She blinked at him. Adoption agency? Part of our agreement, before we ever married, was that there would be no children. I specifically asked Dr. Lachele if she'd talked to you about it, and she said she had. He shook his head, looking at her accusingly. You told me you couldn't get pregnant. My doctor told me that. The doctor here just said that doctors are wrong sometimes. She looked down at her delicious breakfast, unable to eat another bite. I was as shocked as you are. But you still haven't talked to an adoption agency? What are you planning to do with it? It? I told you it's a her. I'm planning to love her. Everything inside me is screaming at the very idea that I'd have to get rid of her. He stood up, walking away from the table and turning his back on her. This feels like the worst kind of betrayal. You made me feel like you didn't want children either. She sighed, feel the tears she'd managed to hold at bay start to silently fall. I was resigned to the fact that I couldn't have children. When you didn't want them, it made it easier for me. This was not intentional. I don't want a child. I don't care if it's a girl, a boy, or a Martian. I'd have taken a dog, but not a human. He turned to her, his face full of a mixture of anger and sadness. I don't know how we're going to get past this. I don't either. I never intended to get pregnant, but I love this baby already. I can't imagine what it would feel like to give it away. If you want me to go, I will. She couldn't imagine life without him either, but if that's what he wanted, there was nothing she could do about it. Colin frowned. I don't want you to go, but I don't want to be a father. Let me get back to you on that. He raked his fingers through his hair. I'm going for a walk. I'll be back in a few hours. He went into the bedroom and put on a hat, snowshoes, gloves, and his winter coat he wore when he was out all day in the cold. Be careful, she said as she watched him go. In that moment, she knew she was spending the rest of her life alone. There was no way anything else was going to happen. He didn't want her child, and she didn't want anything more than the baby. They were at an impasse, and it was one they'd never be able to resolve. He nodded, his eyes not meeting hers. He needed time away from her at the moment. He loved her, and he'd trusted her. And she was pregnant. He shut the door behind him, walking blindly out into the new fallen snow. For the first time ever, he couldn't even appreciate the beauty that was the Alaskan winter. As soon as he was gone, Beverly hurried around the house, removing every single Christmas decoration. Her favorite holiday, and it was in ruins. She should have known better than telling him on Christmas. What was she thinking? While she worked, she talked to the baby, who was very real to her now. She was choosing the baby over her marriage, so the child had better be real. This ornament was one your grandpa gave me when I was just a little girl. Someday, I'm going to give it to you. She took an advent calendar off the wall. This is a calendar your grandma gave me when I was small. I always loved to count down to Christmas starting in September, but she could never find one that lasted for 4 months. I'm sorry your daddy doesn't want you, Beverly said as she washed the breakfast dishes and put them away. It's okay though, because I love you with everything inside me. We're going to be a team, and we're going to be happy together. I'd do anything for you. I hope you know that. The more she put away the Christmas decorations, the more resolved she was. This baby was hers, and nothing was going to keep her from loving her for the rest of her life. What should I call you? I was thinking Colleen, because it's close to Colin, but that may be the only thing you ever have to do with your father. I really think he's going to kick us out as soon as you're born, well, as soon as we've been married a year. He'd probably kick me out now, but he signed a contract saying we'd live together for at least a year. She sighed. He also told me he loved me just this morning. I'm sure he wishes he could take those words back, but he can't. I know he loves me. But I also know there's no way he can love me half as much as I love you. If he did, he wouldn't be acting like I've hit him over the head with a baseball bat, just because I love you so much. By noon, she had the house completely devoid of Christmas. The gifts she'd lovingly made and wrapped for Colin were still in the corner where the Christmas tree had been, and she hadn't touched her own gifts. Why would she want a gift from a man who was rejecting her for something she couldn't really control? Sure, she could put the baby up for adoption, but it truly wasn't in her to do so. He had to know that about her by now. If he loved her, didn't he love that part of her as well? Beverly wished that she felt like she could call Lachele, but she wouldn't do it on Christmas Day. She'd wait a few days, and hopefully things would be better between her and Colin by then, but she had a feeling they wouldn't. Her pregnancy and love for the child she carried was going to kill her marriage. She could always move back to New York, but what waited for her there? Nothing that she could think of. No, she'd stay in Healy. Surely there was a little house she could buy there, and then she could torment herself by seeing Colin on occasion. She made a thick, hearty soup for lunch, knowing that Colin was going to be hungry when he got back from his walk. Unless he intruded on one of the other rangers' Christmas, he would be starving and cold. She sat down and ate alone, not waiting for him, because she had no idea when he'd be back. Whatever happened, she had to keep her calorie count up for the baby. More chocolate would be very nice at the moment. She washed the dish and spoon she'd dirted and put them away. Turning the soup to simmer, so he could eat when he got home, she went into their bedroom. Would he even want her sleeping there any longer? She had no way of knowing. For now, she wasn't going to move all her things to the spare room, but if it's what he wanted when he arrived home, she'd do exactly that. She would be as accommodating as possible and take the high road. They had to live together for 7 more months, there was no reason to do it in anger. She slipped under the mound of quilts on the bed and snuggled onto her left side, which is how the doctor told her he wanted her sleeping. She fell asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow, one arm curved protectively over her belly. No one was going to tell her she couldn't keep her baby. No one. Colin walked and walked. Everywhere he looked, there was beauty. There was nowhere as lovely as Alaska in the winter, or summer, spring, or fall, for that matter. It was the most beautiful place on earth. Anytime he got upset about something, he walked, because it always made him feel better. He didn't know where he was going, so he simply trudged ahead. He simply couldn't understand how a woman whom he knew loved him, wasn't willing to give in to this one thing. He hadn't asked her to abort the baby, as many men in his position would have done. No, he'd asked her to put the baby with loving parents who would have cared for it. He kept to the trail, because it was safer. The area around him was truly a wilderness yet, and no one should be out alone without some kind of protection. He hadn't thought of anything but bundling up and getting out, though. How could she do this to him? They'd agreed no children. If she was telling the truth and believed she'd not be able to conceive, then maybe he could understand the mistake, but not giving the baby up for adoption? That was the ultimate slap in the face. What was he supposed to do now? He had signed a contract to stay with her for the next 7 months at least, but the baby would be born before that. How far along had she said she was? Had she said? As soon as she mentioned pregnancy, he'd seen red. The logical thing to do was probably let her live there until their year was up, and then they would separate. He sighed. He really didn't want to let her go. He loved her, and he wanted them to be able to work this out, but how could they? She was being stubborn and unreasonable. Thinking back over their 5 months together, he knew that this was the first time she'd ever refused to do as he asked. Or refused to change her plans to suit him. He shook his head. It must be really important to her to keep the baby. But where did that leave him? He walked back into the house at just after 1 and stopped short. She'd taken down every bit of Christmas decorations, leaving a pile of gifts in the corner. That was a lot of work, and it had been done quickly. He was always amazed at what a hard worker Beverly was. He wasn't sure he'd ever met someone who worked quite as hard as her when they weren't being paid. He followed his nose to the kitchen, finding a big pot of a hearty soup. He got down a soup bowl and served himself a bowl, wondering where she'd gotten to. Her SUV was still in the driveway, so he knew she had to be home. Probably napping. Was that why she was suddenly napping every day? Because of the baby? He'd have to find out how the pregnancy was affecting her. Not wanting the baby didn't make him magically hate her. He still loved her. She bent over backwards to take care of him, and he couldn't complain about that at all. When he had finished his lunch, he set the bowl and spoon in the sink, settling on the couch to wait for her. He still wanted her to open the gifts he'd gotten her, and he still wanted to spend the day with her. Maybe they could avoid talking about the baby for a while, and go on as they had been. When Beverly woke from her nap, she immediately used the bathroom, before walking into the living room to find Colin sitting in silence. It was very unlike him not to have at least the television on. He rarely watched it, but he liked the noise it provided. She stood for a moment in the doorway, wondering if he wanted her in there with him. He'd seemed so angry earlier, she just had no idea what to expect. He patted the seat beside him on the couch, and she walked over to sit close to him. He put his arm around her and stroked her arm. "How are you feeling? I should have asked that first thing, and I'm sorry I didn't." She shrugged. "I had some dizzy spells back in October, which is why I went to the doctor in the first place. I wasn't sure what was wrong with me, and pregnancy hadn't even occurred to me. I thought I was having a delayed reaction to the altitude. And now? I'm doing better, really. I'm tired, and I need to pee all the time, but other than that, I'm fine. I'm sure as I get bigger, things will be harder for me, but for now, I'm doing all right." She watched him as she described her physical state. Did this mean he was now fine with the baby? "I walked a lot. Miles of trail. I thought a lot too. Is it possible for us to go on as if nothing is wrong? We can make a decision later, when we are forced to, but for now, I want to keep living with the woman I love and be happy." Is that too much to ask? Beverly thought about his offer. "Are you asking me not to talk about how I'm feeling during that time?" "Not at all. I want to know how you feel. I just don't want to know much about the baby for now. I have to get used to the idea. Can I turn our spare room into a room for the baby? A room for a baby with a freezer in it? That will be weird." "It will, but it's the room we've got, and I need a place to put all the things I'm making for her." He considered it for a moment, before nodding. "Yes, you can turn that into a nursery." "Thank you." Maybe he would come around after all. She certainly hoped so. "Why did you remove all of Christmas from our home? You told me you'd probably leave it up until the end of January." "I felt like I had to. I don't want Christmas spoiled for any reason, and if I remember the day we had our first real fight as Christmas Day, then I might have a problem still loving it like I do." "I can understand that. I still want you to open my gifts." He hadn't had anyone to buy for at Christmas time for a whole lot of years. His parents had died when he was in his early 20s, and he'd never had siblings. He'd looked forward to this Christmas almost as much as she had. She nodded. I'd like that. And you'll open mine? I will. He got down on the floor and took the pile of presents there, carefully dividing them between them. He moved back beside her and nudged her with his elbow. You first. All right, I'll go first, but then I want to take turns. I want to see your face when you open some of these things. He looked at the things she had, and picked a small box from the pile. This one first. Beverly looked down at the neatly wrapped box, surprised he was so good at wrapping. Beautiful wrapping job. I ordered it gift wrap. You deserve to have a prettier present than I could possibly make happen on my own. She grinned, not at all surprised by Colin's confession. Well, it's gorgeous, no matter who wrapped it. She carefully unwrapped it, trying not to rip the paper. She wasn't one of those women who saved all wrapping paper, but she liked to prolong the pleasure of opening something. When she had liberated the box from its wrapping paper, she was no wiser as to what it was. It was now a plain cardboard box. Opening the box, she pulled out a beautiful ornament with two moose gazing into each other's eyes. It said, Our First Christmas, 2017. Beverly and Colin. She had tears in her eyes as she looked at him. I love it. He pulled her toward him and kissed her forehead. Me too. And it's our first Christmas. Not our last. Her heart skipped a beat at his words. Maybe he'd let her stay after all. Now you. He picked up one of the packages she'd wrapped for him and unwrapped it quickly, sending paper flying in every direction. She had to laugh at his enthusiasm. He held up the quilt she'd made. It had alternating brown and moose on a blue background blocks, and she'd tied it with a blue string. He'd never seen a quilt quite like that. It's a tie quilt. I thought it would be nice to use here in the living room while you're watching TV. I love it. He leaned down, kissing her softly. Maybe their day hadn't started well, but it was going to end well. She had every right to enjoy her favorite holiday, and he could worry about the baby tomorrow. Chapter 7. After their difficult Christmas, Colin and Beverly decided to stay in for New Year's. She made one of their favorite meals, and they sat in front of the fire, playing Scrabble. She'd been a big fan in high school, but she hadn't had anyone to play with in years. It was fun to have something to do with him and someone to play the game with her. They had snacks for the evening, and she'd made a huge pot of soup for them to eat on all night. Just before midnight, they counted down together, kissing at the stroke of midnight. I think I like our little private celebration better than being in Times Square for the holiday. You've done New Year's in Times Square? He knew she was from New York, but it had never occurred to him she'd done the big celebration. My senior year in high school, I begged and begged to go. My boyfriend at the time was going, and he wanted me there too. We'd been dating for almost a year, and he wanted to do the midnight kiss thing. She shrugged. My parents finally agreed, but I had to call every hour to let them know I was still okay. Mom almost went with me, which would have mortified me. I can see that. He shook his head. Growing up in Alaska has some good points, but having done things like that is not one of them. I've spent hours and hours hunting and doing everything I could to preserve the forests here. I even did some mountain climbing many years ago. But I have never been to New York City. It's hard to believe there are that many people there. My mind just can't fathom it. I wish we could take a trip there. I think if I could show you what I love about it, you'd understand. I could take you to a play on Broadway and to Central Park. I've never understood the Central Park thing. If you want to be surrounded by acres of wilderness, why wouldn't you live in Alaska, instead of in the middle of a big city? She grinned. You live in New York for all of the advantages. There are jobs everywhere, you can eat out at a million different places, or have just about anything brought in. If you want to go shopping, there are so many different places to shop. You don't have to drive hours to a grocery store. But you don't have Santa's house, you don't have wide open spaces. And most importantly, you don't have me. Admit it, I'm worth staying in Alaska for. The grin on Colin's face had her shaking her head. All she could think about was that he was worth staying for, but was she worth raising a child for? She couldn't ask it, but it made her sad during what had been a wonderful night. Her baby mattered to her so much, and they had an agreement not to talk about her. How was she supposed to stay happy? Yes, you're worth staying in Alaska for, she said softly, leaning forward for his kiss. Somehow though, his words made her realize she wouldn't be able to leave things as they were for much longer. She could enjoy being around him, and she would, but she also needed to be making plans for her and her daughter, whatever she decided to name her. She didn't dare bring up the topic of baby names with him. Their agreement was too fragile still. By the end of January, Beverly was showing a great deal. She no longer fit into her clothes, and she had enlisted Amazon to getting her what she needed to wear. Her nightgown still fit, but she preferred to wear actual clothes through the winter. She never knew when someone lost would come to their home for help in finding their way. Sure, they were far off the beaten path, but people weren't exactly smart about following the park rules. When she started getting the packages of clothes from Amazon, she moved all of her normal clothes to the spare room closet. She started collecting little pink clothes for the baby, and even chose a diaper bag. She knew she wouldn't go a lot of places with the baby, but anywhere she went was far. She ordered a crib, not realizing it would need to be assembled, so the day it arrived, near the end of February, she sat on the floor in the spare room and built a crib. She'd already had Colin disassemble the bed, and she was ready to work at getting the furniture ready for the baby. She was only about 2 months from the baby's due date, and she didn't feel like she was anywhere near ready. Beverly decided on a Sesame Street theme for the baby's room, so she worked to make things for the baby with the characters from the show on them. She already had a quilt hanging on the wall over where the crib would be, as well as sheets and a diaper pad cover that featured Big Bird. She'd never assembled any furniture before, so she sat staring at the instructions, wondering what on earth she was thinking. She was almost 7 months pregnant, and she was sitting on the floor in her baby's room, building a crib alone. She hadn't signed on for the single mother thing. All of a sudden, the tears began to flow. Why did she have to do this alone? It took 2 to make a baby, and she knew exactly who the father was. Didn't he have a responsibility too? Colin found her there, sitting on the floor, crying. What's wrong? Are you hurt? She shook her head. I need help building the crib, but I don't feel like I can ask you, but I don't know how to assemble furniture, but you hate my baby, so I need someone I can ask for help that's not you. He followed her words, but just barely. I'll help you. I don't hate the baby, I just don't feel what you feel for her. He reached down and took her hand, helping her to her feet. You can't be climbing on the floor in your condition. You're huge. She started crying even harder at his words. I can't even see my feet anymore. He pulled her into his arms, stroking her back. I can see them. I promise, they're still there. Beverly gave a hiccuping laugh. Well, that's good to know. I wasn't sure if they'd fallen off or something. Not at all. He nudged her toward the kitchen. This is manly work. You go into the kitchen and make me some supper to eat after I finish my manly work. She glared at him. Now you're just being a pain in my butt. Colin grinned, sitting in the same spot she'd just vacated on the floor. I'll have this built in no time. Beverly hadn't even had a thought about supper yet, so it was a good thing it would take him a while to build the crib. She hadn't even put 2 pieces of the thing together. The crying had begun as soon as she'd looked at the instructions. She quickly thawed some meat in the microwave, determined to make something special. He was helping her with something he wanted nothing to do with after all. They still hadn't talked about the future and what would happen when the baby arrived, but neither of them were willing to upset their tentative truce by bringing it up. She ended up making an enchilada casserole, finding that she was craving Mexican food and only Mexican food while she was pregnant. Colin still hadn't complained about the massive amounts of tortillas and refried beans he'd been forced to consume. When she got the casserole out of the oven, she went in to check on him and found him standing up and tightening what looked like the last bolt. You got it done. She flew at him, wrapping her arms around him. Thank you so much. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. I can help with things like this, you know. There's no reason for you to be climbing on the floor, trying to do everything yourself. I just didn't think you'd care to help build furniture for a baby you don't even want. He sighed, hating that the subject had been broached. He'd done much better when he could pretend everything was fine between them. I'm not doing it for the baby. I'm doing it for you. Good, 'cause little Sarah can't help me build anything, and I obviously do not have the skills. She looped her arm through his. Supper's ready. I made enchilada casserole. That baby is going to come out with brown eyes and corn tortillas for skin. Why brown eyes? I'm thinking the exact color of refried beans. She giggled, thrilled that he was talking about the baby now. Do you like the name Sarah? He shrugged. I guess if we need a name, Sarah works. It was my sister's name. She walked to the stove and served their meal, getting them both big glasses of water. You don't talk about your sister much. Mainly just your parents. What was she like? Beverly shrugged. She was 5 years younger than me, so I considered her a royal pain in my butt. I never really gave her credit for being Sarah, just for being annoying. Does that make sense? It does. And then she died and you felt guilty? Yeah. I wish I'd gotten to know her. At her funeral, her teachers were talking about how bright and funny she was. Her friends kept saying that they couldn't imagine going on without her. I didn't know that Sarah. I knew the Sarah who hogged the bathroom and who was always experimenting with my makeup, even though she wasn't allowed. You shared a bathroom? No, that's what made me so mad. She'd use my bathroom even though she had one of her own. Beverly shrugged. I have few memories of the good things about my sister, and I want my daughter named after her, so I can remember to look for the good in people, and not just the bad. Besides, I've always loved the name Sarah. She put his plate in front of him and sat down beside him, her hand sliding into his for their prayer. I'm glad you came up with a name you like. Me too. It was the most they'd talked about the baby since the day she told him she was expecting. She knew it was odd, but it gave her hope for the future. He changed the subject then, telling her about a tourist who was camping in the park in the snow, and didn't have a sleeping bag. He said he liked cold, and he was going to be fine without one. Colin shook his head. I swear the tourists get dumber every year. They should be smart like all of us native Alaskans. He laughed. You're a native now? I thought you were just living here because your husband is here. Hey, I married a native, and that gives me native Alaskan status. Don't argue with me, or I won't let you have my native New Yorker status. Are there people who actually want native New Yorker status? Does that mean they were born honking at people? Beverly frowned at him. You've never been. You can't criticize a place you've never visited. That's not fair. He shrugged. Are you sure? 'Cause it feels fair from where I'm sitting. It might be time to find a new chair then. When Beverly went for her appointment in mid-March, Dr. Young informed her it was time to start seeing her weekly. And why hasn't your husband come with you yet? Have you taken childbirth classes? I don't have a partner for the classes. My husband isn't interested in becoming a father. Beverly kept her chin up as she said the words, as much as she hated they were true. The doctor shook her head. He's going to be a father in about 6 weeks regardless. How does he think not going for childbirth classes will help anything? I don't know. Beverly shrugged. I don't really know anyone else in this area who I'd want to go to the classes with me. It's your husband's responsibility. I hope he realizes that you didn't go out and get yourself pregnant. Dr. Young used the Doppler on Beverly's stomach. Good strong heartbeat. Your weight is still a little lower than I'd like at this stage of your pregnancy, but I can tell you've been making an effort to eat more. I really have. I eat as much as I possibly can before I feel like I'm going to burst. All right. I'll see you in a week. Let's see if we can make the scale move. Even a half-pound would make me happy right about now. I'll do my best. Beverly walked out of the exam room, wondering if there was someone at the church she and Colin attended who would be willing to do childbirth classes with her. She felt like it was such a huge thing to ask that she hated the very idea of it. When Colin came in that evening from work, he sought her out in the kitchen where she was putting supper on the table. "Why didn't you tell me you needed a partner for childbirth classes? I'm the one who should be there with you, not some stranger." "How?" "Dr. Young called me. She told me she didn't care if I wanted the baby or not, you hadn't gotten pregnant by yourself, and I needed to get rid of my worthless father attitude and take you to childbirth classes." Beverly bit her lip, trying not to laugh. She couldn't picture the serious Dr. Young telling him that, but they were words she'd have used herself if she'd thought of them. "So you're going to take me?" "I don't see anyone else lining up to do it. Sarah has to come out, and I'm going to be there holding your hand. I love you too much to let you go through something like that alone. Thank you." She didn't know what else to say. Even though they rarely mentioned the baby, he'd now built 2 pieces of furniture, and he didn't know it yet, but she had a glider rocker that would be there any day. "Sign us up for the classes, and let me know when they are. I'm not making you go through it alone." Colin kissed her softly. "Now I'm going to go shower before dinner, because I had a rough day." She finished up the meal and served it just as he came back into the kitchen. "Why was your day hard?" He shook his head. "Tourists. I promise, you don't want me to get started." If stories about tourists were funny, he shared them readily. The ones that were difficult or obnoxious she rarely heard about. "All right. I won't ask then." "Should I be going to the doctor with you?" he asked, frowning at her. "Aren't fathers supposed to go to these appointments?" "You can, but most of the appointments are at times you're working, so I haven't asked." "Let me know when the next one is, and I'll go with you. I want to make sure you're healthy enough to have this baby. I don't want you dying on me or anything. I promise not to die." She handed him a glass of water and sat down. "You can go with me if you want, but I've done very well on my own. Whether I like it or not, the doctor's right, and we're in this together. You let me know when to be there, and I'll be there." "Does that mean you're going to build the glider rocker that Amazon tells me will be here within the next week?" He groaned. "Please tell me that's the last piece of furniture. That baby is going to have more furniture than we do." She laughed. "I promise, it's the last. And that is furniture I'll use when I rock her, and I'll probably nurse her there as well." "Nurse? You're not going to bottle feed?" Somehow, he'd never imagined she'd nurse the baby, but he wasn't sure why. "No, I want to do everything that's best for her. Breast is the best way to feed a baby, so that's what I'm doing at least for the first few months. I want her to get all the immunity she can from me." "Have you been reading books on this or something?" Beverly nodded. "I have about 6 books I've been reading. Some are on child-rearing, and some are just on pregnancy. I'm going to be the best mother I can possibly be. I never dreamed I'd have the opportunity to have a baby, but now that I'm about to, I'm going to make the most of it. She deserves to have the very best." He frowned. "I guess she's going to be the center of your world." "Don't you think she should be?" Beverly asked the question softly, determined to let him figure out she was doing the right thing by himself. "Yeah, I guess so. I've enjoyed being the center of your world for the past few months. I can't believe I'm about to be displaced by someone a fraction of my weight." She put her hand over his, squeezing softly. "You'll still be the #1 guy in my world. She'll just be my favorite girl." Chapter 8. After the doctor's phone call, Colin endeavored to be more involved in Beverly's pregnancy. He started to help her up when she looked like she couldn't move off a chair or the couch. When she got up during the night, he always sat up and turned the lamp on, so she wouldn't feel like she needed to move around in the dark. He even put together the glider without a single complaint. They started childbirth classes the next week, and as he began to understand exactly what she was about to go through, he wanted to scream. He didn't want the baby she carried, and it could actually threaten her life. No way was he going to put up with that. After the first class, he took her to a small pizza place in Healy, determined to make it a positive experience for her. She'd gone through most of her pregnancy with no help from him at all, and he felt terrible about it. "What kind of pizza do you want?" She studied the menu. "I want taco pizza." "I don't think they offer that, sweetheart." "What else sounds good?" "Taco pizza." She frowned, pushing the menu away. She wanted what she wanted, and at 7.5 months pregnant, she should be able to get it. Colin stood up and walked over to where he could see the cook standing, whispering something to the man. He got a nod in response and walked back to the table. "We're having taco pizza. Have I ever told you that you're the best husband I've ever had? I'm so glad I stack up nicely against all the other husbands you've had." "Dozens, I assume?" "Oh, definitely dozens. And I've had babies with every one of them." "I'm sure." He took her hand and put it to his lips. "If you have to be uncomfortable carrying my baby, the least I can do is make sure you get to eat whatever you want to eat while you're growing her." Beverly got down to the serious business of buying baby clothes at the end of March. She only had about a month to go, and she knew she would need some good clothes. The hard part would be buying winter clothes in the summer, and she knew that her baby was going to need some cold weather clothes to make it through an Alaskan summer. She started with the clearance online, and had several boxes of clothing shipped to her. She got the first 4 sizes the baby would need, knowing she might have to move some of it. She worried less about Colin asking her and Sarah to leave after the baby was born than she had in the beginning, but she still had it in the back of her mind that it could happen. One day in mid-April, after the childbirth classes were over, Colin found her in the baby's room, arranging clothes by size in the closet. "You know you're only having one baby, right?" he teased. "That little girl is going to have to wear everything twice, and then pass it on. She has more clothes than you'd need for triplets." "That's what you think. Do you know how many outfits a baby can go through in a day? They spit up a lot, and they have blowouts." "Do you know what a blowout is?" He shook his head. "I don't want to know." She started to tell him, but thought better of it. He already didn't want the baby, so why would she tell him stories that would make it even worse? "Trust me, we want lots of clothes." "I'll take your word for it." He caught her to him, tilting her chin up for his kiss. "How are you feeling today?" "Very, very round. I swear the only thing holding me together is my clothing." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I had no idea I'd be so uncomfortable toward the end. I need a massage, a pedicure, and maybe a long hot bath. Do you have any idea what I'd do for a bathtub right about now?" He frowned, hating that she was living in discomfort, even though it was temporary. "I'll see what I can do." She shrugged his comment off as she went back to work, finishing up supper for them both. As tired as she was, they still needed to eat, and she wasn't about to start eating beans and canned beef stew, which she knew was all he would feed her. When Colin left for work the following morning, he told Beverly to pack a bag for both of them. "Comfortable clothes. We're not going anywhere fancy, but we will be gone for 2 nights. She gave him a strange look, because he hadn't mentioned anything about taking a trip, but she wasn't about to argue. She'd had enough of the 4 walls in that little cabin anyway. She was ready for something else. When he got home from work that evening, he took the suitcase she'd packed to the car. "You ready?" "How far are we going?" "Fairbanks. I have a surprise. Let me use the bathroom first. My pregnant bladder will make us stop over and over again otherwise." She rushed into the bathroom. When she was out, he'd put the suitcase in the back of her SUV. "I'm going to drive your car. I think it will be easier for you to get in and out of it than for you to get in and out of the truck." He was doing his best to make the weekend as perfect for her as he could. As they drove, she watched the scenery, thinking about how very blessed little Sarah would be to grow up in a place that was so beautiful. She loved the idea of her baby living in a place like Alaska, with the minimal pollution, beautiful scenery, and elemental values. On the way to Fairbanks, he stopped at Santa's house. She grinned at him. "You don't mind?" He shook his head. "How could I mind? I know you want to get an ornament for Sarah." Beverly leaned over and kissed his cheek. "You always pick out the best fudge. Would you get some for me?" Colin grinned at her. You just don't want to be on your feet any longer than necessary, so you want me to do it for you. That might be a little bit true. He laughed. I'm on to you, woman. Isn't that what got me in the shape I'm in? She blew him a kiss as she slid out of the SUV and walked toward the store. Her movements were slow, because she was hurting. The weight of the baby was too much for her. He hurried ahead of her and opened the door, bowing gallantly, which made her laugh. He was in jeans and a huge parka, and he was acting like the fanciest of gentlemen. Thank you, kind sir. Anytime, milady. He went to the back of the store and exercised his fudge-choosing skills, while she picked out a special ornament for the baby. They hadn't been to Santa's house since she'd announced she was pregnant, and the joy it brought her to see the little shop again made him feel guilty. She didn't spend long, quickly choosing what she wanted and paying for it. She couldn't be on her feet long with the way she was feeling. She had started sitting a lot as she cooked, chopping vegetables at the table. 10 minutes later, they were again on their way, this time going to wherever he'd chosen to take her for the weekend. Why are you being all secretive and stuff? She asked, wondering if he would tell her what was going on. Because the love of my life is pregnant and uncomfortable. She deserves to be treated like a queen. He didn't take his eyes off the road as he pulled off the highway and into a hotel's parking lot. You wait here. I'm going to find out which room we're in, so you don't have to get out more than once. As he hurried away from the car, she grinned at him. He really was going all out to make this a special weekend. It was just what she needed to keep from losing her mind. She'd heard the term baby moon, and wondered if this was it. He was back out a few minutes later, and drove her to a side building. I asked for a room on the end, so you wouldn't have to walk so far. You're my hero. If I was really feeling heroic, I'd just carry you, but I have a feeling you'd protest. You'd break your back carrying both of us. It's all I can do to carry her around. I hope she comes soon. She rubbed at the foot kicking her in the side, trying to silently tell the baby to stop her nonsense. Wait, soon? When exactly are you due? His question gave her the giggles, though she wasn't certain why. Don't you think you should have asked that a few months ago? Maybe. When are you due? He was panicking a little, thinking about how far from her doctor they were, being there in the city. The doctor estimates May 1st. So the baby will be here May 1st? Well, that's her due date. It will be around then, maybe a week or two before or after. Didn't he know that babies didn't come on their due dates? He stared at her, aghast. So you're telling me I brought you hours from your doctor, and you could go into labor any second? She shrugged. Why is that so shocking? I just thought you had more time before she came. What if you go into labor here? How would I get you back in time? There are hospitals in Fairbanks. If I go into labor, you can take me to one. There's a good chance it won't be my doctor delivering the baby even if we're at home. There are 3 doctors on call, and it could be any one of them when I delivered. He groaned. I'm not liking this at all. I want you to be seen by whomever you feel comfortable with, not some random doctor you don't know. I trust the other doctors, because Dr. Young does. I promise, I'm going to be all right. I'm going to be right there with you, holding your hand. I promise I will. Thank you. She was a bit amused by his adamancy, but she said nothing. She was feeling more every day like their marriage just might work. She didn't want to get her hopes up too high, but he seemed more comfortable with the idea of the baby every day. Beverly got out of the car and began the long, slow walk into the hotel. He got the suitcase and moved in front of her, making sure he opened the door, so she could sit right away. I thought we could go out for crepes again tonight. We haven't been since right after we married. She grinned. I'd love that. What are we doing tomorrow? You're having a spa day. I'm not sure what I'm doing yet. I might stay here in the hotel room, watch television, and sleep. A spa day? Really? Did you tell them I'm pregnant? I did. I wasn't sure if a massage was safe for a pregnant woman, so they're getting you something called a prenatal massage. She launched herself at him where he was sitting on the bed, and he let himself be knocked completely over. Pressing kisses all over his face, she said, "You're the best husband in this whole hotel room. Your praises always leave me feeling like I'm lacking somehow. I need to up my game." She giggled, sitting up. "Let's go get crepes. I'm going to have the ham and cheese again, and I'm going to have a dessert crepe. The doctor wants me to gain a few pounds." "What? Are you unhealthy? Is that baby risking your life?" "No, I'm fine. I'm just a bit under the weight I should be at this stage of my pregnancy. I've always been a little underweight. I'm eating like crazy, and I plan to devour some fudge later. I don't like that the doctor thinks you're too small. Should I hire someone to do the housework until the baby is born?" Beverly shook her head. "No, you shouldn't. I only have 2 weeks left. It's going to be fine." "I hope so." He got up and took her hand, pulling her toward the SUV. "Do you need to use the bathroom before we go?" She nodded emphatically. "Pregnancy bladder. You shouldn't even have to ask." Colin watched her disappear into the bathroom with a bemused smile. She was taking the pregnancy and everything that went with it, with a positive attitude. He loved it. Before she came out, he hurried out to move the SUV to right in front of the door, and then he called her. "I'm waiting right in front of the door, so you don't have to walk as far." "Sounds good to me." Beverly hurried out to the car, as fast as she could hurry in her condition. "Let's eat." He drove the short distance to the restaurant, and left her at the door to go order for them both, while he parked the SUV. He was doing his best to make her walk as little as possible. When he joined her after finding a parking spot, she was sitting at one of the tables, waiting for her food. "Good, here's our number. You can go get it for me. I think I'm sitting here until I have to move. And I'd better be fed first." She took a swig out of her water bottle, watching him over the top of it. "No problem. You're going to be relaxed by the end of this weekend if it kills me. Don't die." Her words were earnest, but her eyes were sparkling with laughter. "I'll do my very best. I don't want you to have to drive home by yourself. You'd have to tie my body to the roof of the car. And that would just be weird, wouldn't it?" Beverly frowned at him. "How would I get you up there? I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm 8.5 months pregnant, and that's awfully pregnant to be lifting random men to the top of my car." "I'm not a random man. I'm your husband." "That doesn't make you any less random in my eyes." He heard their number called and got up to get their food. "Am I still random now that I'm the man who is holding your food hostage?" She frowned at him. "You'd starve your pregnant wife and daughter just because she called you random? You're very random at times." Colin laughed, shaking his head. "Fine, I'll feed you, but you'd better be thinking about how much you love and appreciate me." "I never think of anything else. You are my sun, moon, stars, and random husband, whom I love a little more every decade." He groaned. "Again with the compliments that bite me to the quick. Isn't it supposed to be cut me to the quick? Now you're threatening to cut me? What have I gotten myself into?" She rolled her eyes. "I heard from Dr. Lachele today. She told me that we need to call her as soon as the baby is born, and get her a picture right away. She said she keeps a scrapbook of all her matrimony munchkins, and that Sarah will be her favorite until the next one is born. I think her attitude is rubbing off on you. Her favorite for a short while. Just like I'm your favorite husband who drove you to Fairbanks today." Beverly looked at him with wide eyes. "You don't want to be my favorite? I guess you can be my least favorite, but that seems a little mean to me." Colin shook his head. "I'm going to trade you in for a wife who's nice to me." "Nice to you? If I was nice to you, you wouldn't know what to do with me." "That might just be true." He sighed. "Eat your crepes, wife. You need your energy for your massage, pedicure, and hair appointment tomorrow." "Hair? My hair hasn't been cut since I got here." "I get a real haircut? By someone who isn't named Bob and doesn't have a barber pole in front of his shop?" "Hey, Bob's a good guy, we've been friends for years." She patted his hand with one hand even as she forked up a bite of crepe with the other. I needed a weekend away. Thank you for making it happen for me. Haven't you realized yet that there's nothing I won't do for you? He turned his hand over to capture hers, using it to bring her hand to his lips. She smiled, leaning her head onto his shoulder. He was good to her, even though she'd disappointed him with the baby. She was just glad he was moving on and not upset with her any longer. She prayed every day that when he saw their little girl, he'd realize how much he wanted her. Someone stopped at the table beside them. Colin? I thought you were still working at Denali, wrangling bears and tourists. Colin got to his feet with a grin. Jim. It's good to see you. Are you still trying to force kids to like history? I sure am. And loving it. This is my wife, Beverly. And this is an old buddy of mine from high school, Jim. Beverly got to her feet, offering her hand to shake. It's nice to meet you. Jim glanced at her belly. I guess maybe you're joining the world of fatherhood with the rest of us. Took you long enough. I didn't think you'd ever have kids. Colin kept his smile carefully in place. I didn't either. Life changes you. So does the love of a good woman. Jim clapped Colin on the back. Stay happy, my friend. I'm about to run these crepes home to my wife. She's not pregnant, but she is hungry, so I feed her. I'm glad we ran into you. Colin needed to hear the other man's perspective. It was good for him. Me too. With a wave, Jim was gone. Chapter 9. For Beverly, the weekend was a dream. It was odd having to lie on her side for the entire massage, but she was pleased it wasn't hurting the baby. Colin was at her beck and call, taking her everywhere she wanted to go, and making sure she got her Mexican food fix. Are you going to need to keep eating this much Mexican food after the baby is born? He asked on Saturday evening as they sat down to one of the local Mexican places. I hope not, but maybe. She seems to want Mexican more than anything else in the world. He shook his head. She's already turning our lives upside down, and she's not even here yet. It will be even worse when she is here. Midnight feedings, diaper changes, and all. My whole world is going to have to revolve around her. He started to ask her if she was sure that's what she wanted, but he checked himself. There would be no negative words about the baby that weekend. He would adjust, and that would be the end of it. Are you feeling better after your massage? Definitely. I needed that relaxation in a way I haven't needed anything in a very long time. Beverly reached out and covered his hand with hers. Thank you. You're very welcome. When I realized how much you hurt, I felt like I'd neglected you more than I should during this pregnancy. I'm going to make up for it. She smiled. There's no need. It sounded like he was accepting the baby more and more, and that's all she asked. I appreciate all the furniture you built, and you really went above and beyond this weekend. I wish I'd done more all along. He picked up his menu. Now what Mexican food have you not figured out how to cook and made a dozen times in the past few months? Beverly swatted his arm with a giggle. I haven't been that bad. I've had every kind of Mexican food known to man. You've definitely been that bad. I would say I'm sorry, but I'm not. Baby girl got what she needed. And for Colin, that was the bottom line right there. The baby was more important than anything or anyone else in his world. He'd have to get used to it or he'd have to end their marriage. Why should he have to choose? Monday morning, Beverly had a bout of renewed energy. She hurried through the house, cleaning everything. Every quilt, every surface, and every floor. By the time she was ready to start supper, every single surface shined. She had even skipped her nap for the first time since she'd found out she was pregnant, determined that she would have the house spotless the first time little Sarah saw it. Throwing together a thick, hearty soup, which she knew was Colin's favorite after a long day at work, she was pleased with her day. It had been long and hard, but now she felt ready to have the baby. She'd even taken the time to pack her hospital suitcase, which included 2 tiny little outfits for the baby. Colin was a bit later than usual, and she waited at the window, watching for him. When he finally came in, he looked exhausted. "Is everything all right?" she asked, hurrying to him and hugging him. "You've never been this late getting home." "A tourist decided to get a selfie with a moose today. I had to stay with him until the care flight arrived. They're still not sure he's going to make it. Why don't people read the signs about not approaching the wildlife?" He shook his head, holding her tightly. "Don't go near the moose, okay?" "I wouldn't. I'm not a stupid tourist. I'm a native Alaskan now, remember?" He grinned, happy she could pull him out of his sadness at what he'd seen that day. There had been an entire patch of snow covered in the idiot's blood. "You think you are? I'm going to give you the test later. You can't be a native unless you pass." "I can do it. I can do anything." At the moment, her superpower was growing another human inside her, but she was sure she could learn more about Alaska than he already knew. She had Google, and she knew how to use it. He sniffed deeply. "Did you make soup?" She nodded. "I found a new recipe for enchilada soup. I thought between the heat of the soup and the spiciness of it, you'd feel warmed from the inside out." "And you wanted Mexican?" "That had very little to do with it," she said with a grin, knowing he wouldn't believe her, and he shouldn't. Her Mexican food obsession had been epic, and she wasn't even ashamed of it. "Uh-huh." He looked down and saw that he had blood on his hands and jeans. "I'm going to shower before supper. If you're super hungry, go ahead and start without me." "Don't think I won't. I'm a pregnant woman, and I'm hungry. You can't delay my meal." He sighed, shaking his head. "I need 5 minutes." Despite her words, she hurried into the kitchen and set the table, putting a huge portion of soup into each of their bowls. She got them glasses of water, and just as she was sitting down, he emerged from the bathroom, his hair still wet from his shower. Her heart beat faster as she watched him walk toward her. How was it that she hadn't gotten used to him in the almost 9 months they'd been married? "The house looks great. What did you do today?" he asked as he sat beside her at the table. "Please tell me you didn't do all that yourself." Beverly shrugged. "Of course I did. I want the house to be beautiful when I bring Sarah home. Tomorrow I'm going to make sure her room is perfect." "Don't do too much. I can help you with anything you need tonight. Or I can find someone who will clean for you. I don't want you hurting yourself or going into early labor." "You know that if I go into labor now, it won't be early? It'll just be labor, right?" She had no qualms about physical labor like she had early in her pregnancy. Her little princess had cooked enough that she could be born at any time she was ready. He shook his head at her, his eyes wide. "I'm not ready. I will be by tomorrow evening. And she'll come when she comes." Babies have a way of ignoring calendars and doing whatever they want to do. He shook his head with a sigh. "What are we going to do with her?" "Love her." She shrugged, knowing he was still struggling with the idea of being a father. "At first, she'll just sleep, eat, and dirty her diapers, but within 6 months or so, she'll be awake a lot. We won't have a problem until she starts crawling and getting into everything." She wondered if she and Sarah would still be with him then. Usually she thought so, and then there were times like this when she truly had no idea what he wanted at all. "I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to help with her much. You work outside the home. I'll be her primary caregiver, and I'll be the one to feed her. You might be asked to change a diaper from time to time, but if you're adamantly opposed to that, then I'll do it." "Sounds good to me." It didn't. He still wasn't sure what she saw as the appeal, but he'd try his hardest to love the baby, for her sake. "Do you want to have a movie night tonight?" she asked. "I ordered a couple of new movies from Amazon, and I thought you might want to watch them with me." "What movies?" He didn't necessarily trust her taste in movies. "Some of the new superhero movies that are out. I thought we could both enjoy those." Colin grinned at her. "You're the best wife a man could ever ask for." Beverly laughed. "Next time maybe we'll watch a chick flick. I love rom-coms." He wrinkled his nose. "I think we should stick with superhero movies." She didn't tell him to expect Disney princess movies to be the norm in just a couple of years. He'd dread the baby coming even more. Beverly did what she wanted done in the baby's room the next day. She carefully dusted every surface, rearranged the clothes, chose 2 more outfits to take to the hospital just in case the baby didn't look good in the ones she was taking, and rearranged the stuffed animals she'd purchased. When she was done with that, she looked for more to do. Surely there were more things that needed to be done before they brought the baby home from the hospital. Then it came to her in a flash. Windows. I need to wash the inside and outside of all the windows. She gathered up the supplies she'd need and started on the outside of the house. It wasn't big, so it shouldn't take her too terribly long. And since it was mid-April, the snow was only up to her knees. Colin hadn't been kidding when he'd said there was a very long winter. Summer nights with her baby and her husband at her side sounded absolutely glorious. She would love to sit outside with some patio furniture. Of course, with the mosquito problem in Alaska, it might be best if she had some mosquito netting to cover Sarah. As she worked, she sang softly under her breath. She had been talking and singing to the baby since she'd found out she existed. She'd heard that would make it so the baby would know her voice when she was born, and the idea thrilled her. She was just finishing up the outside of the last window when her phone rang. Hello? You sound out of breath. What are you doing? Lachele asked. You're going to have that baby any minute, and you should not be exerting yourself. I'm washing the windows. I want the cabin to look absolutely perfect when Sarah sees it for the first time. Lachele sighed. You know she's probably going to be sleeping when you walk into the house with her, right? Cars put most newborns right to sleep. I know, but I still want it to be perfect just in case. I know better than to argue with a crazed pregnant woman. You do remember that I get the first picture of your little munchkin, right? For my scrapbook? I won't forget. Beverly carried the cleaning supplies into the house and shut the door, sinking onto the couch. He's still not excited about her. He's agreed to try to coexist with her, but you can tell he's dreading her coming home with us. I feel like the worst wife alive for choosing my child over him, but she's my baby. Give him time. He may never have the paternal feelings you want him to have for her, but they may develop. He was adamant he didn't want children when I interviewed him, and I talked to you about it as well. I know this baby was an accident, but you're fighting years of him thinking he hates children. Why? That's the thing I really don't get. Beverly wasn't sure if having a reason would make her more understanding or less, but she needed one. Have you asked him? I know he thinks he's too old to raise a child, but I think there might be more to it. I just noted it down, and went on with my life so I could find someone who also didn't want kids. Or couldn't have them, like you. Beverly patted her belly. We blew that theory right out of the water, didn't we? Sure did. I have a patient coming in any second. Ask him. See what you can figure out. Lachele abruptly ended the connection, which was how she seemed to end all her calls. After a moment, Beverly got to her feet. She was chilly after her time outside, and she wanted a hot shower. Surely she would be able to talk to Colin about his hatred of children that night. There had to be a reason. After she'd done the dinner dishes that night, Beverly went to sit on the couch with Colin. He was watching a baseball game, but as soon as he realized she was there, he muted it. How are you feeling? Like an overripe watermelon. How are you feeling? There were times it was impossible to keep her sarcasm at bay. A little overwhelmed by my overripe watermelon of a wife. He slipped his arm around her and snuggled her close. Can I ask you something? She asked softly. Sure, I'm an open book. He looked down at her, thinking about just how thrilled he was she was in his life. If that meant he had to put up with a baby, then he'd do his best. Why do you dislike children so much? Her words were soft, not accusatory. She'd practiced all afternoon about how to keep her voice even. He thought for a moment, not sure how to even answer her question. I don't really dislike them. I just don't think I'll make a good father. I'm too old, and I'm too impatient. I don't see you as impatient at all. Maybe that was true of you years ago, but it's certainly not now. He shrugged. So many of the tourists' kids disobey and go places they're not supposed to go. They're snotty. She nodded. Some are snotty, but not all. Sounds like the children you've been around have been the worst of the worst. Maybe. He sighed. It's just not a desire I've ever had, having kids that is. I don't know how I'm going to handle it, but I do know I will. I promise you that. We'll work on it together. He jumped and looked at her. What was that? What was what? I felt something against my side. Where your belly is touching me. She laughed. That's Sarah protesting that she's pressed up against you. She likes to have a few inches around her at all times. That felt like a real kick, not like the flutters they talked about in the childbirth class. Yeah, Sarah's a bit obnoxious. I have a feeling she's going to be born with a huge amount of personality. I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with that. He shook his head. We're in for a rough ride, aren't we? Probably. I was something of a diva myself, before the car accident. I needed my hair to be perfect at all times, and I wouldn't be caught dead wearing clothes that weren't from Saks or Bloomingdale's. Sarah's going to wear Walmart clothes, and she's going to like it. He laughed. Are you sure? Well, Sarah will be raised a great deal differently than I was. I was in the big stores on Fifth Avenue every weekend with my mom. I didn't think anything of her paying hundreds of dollars for a dress I'd wear once. Beverly shook her head. Sarah will be given the clothes I purchased to wear. I don't think she'll even realize it's possible to pay hundreds of dollars for one item of clothing. I'll pay that much for a good coat or a good pair of boots. She shook her head. No, I'm talking for a party dress. You wear it once, and then you stick it in the back of your closet, because you can't go to 2 parties wearing the same dress. It would be social suicide. Yeah, no. Our daughter is not going to be that way. I'm not sure there's anywhere in Alaska where she could be that way. It's just not how people are around here. Good. I've realized that it was very superficial. People don't need to be that way. She shrugged. Aren't you glad you met me after the accident and not before? Would you have even looked at me twice before? Maybe. I'd have been attracted to you, but my friends would have told me you were there to play with. But you settled down with a Wall Street man. She made a face. I can't believe I was even friends with that kind of person. Yeah, I wouldn't have liked you at all. I probably would have tried to kiss you though. Then I could have bragged to my friends that I kissed a snobby New Yorker. Did you brag to your friends when you kissed a girl? Well, yeah. That's what you're supposed to do, right? I was a Boy Scout, but not an athlete. We Boy Scouts had a harder time finding girls to kiss than the athletes did. She sighed. So let's not tell Sarah about that. Sounds good to me. Chapter 10. It was just a few days later, when Beverly went into labor. She woke at 3 on Saturday morning, her pain strong. She was halfway to the bathroom when her water broke. She groaned, walking into the bathroom to shower. When she had finished cleaning herself up, she walked back into the bedroom to see that Colin had turned on the light for her. He turned to look at her, more than half asleep. Why'd you shower? She sat down on the side of the bed, wearing just her robe. My water broke. It's time to go to the hospital. Hospital? Really? He sat up straight in bed, jumped up, and dressed quickly. Hurry. She laughed. My contractions are still several minutes apart. We have some time. I need to get dressed first. Would you mind putting my suitcase in the car? He grabbed her suitcase, ran it back to the car, and he was with her in less than a minute. I started to warm the car up too. I don't want you catching a chill. Okay. I'm going to call my doctor and let her know how I'm doing. Isn't that my job? In the childbirth classes, they said that I should do that. I think I'm going to make a little more sense at the moment. For a man who didn't want to be a father, he was certainly reacting to her being in labor. She took her phone and dialed the answering service for Dr. Young and her associates. I'm having contractions, and my water just broke. My name is Beverly Geller. She listened for the instructions on the other end of the line. Sounds good. I'll be there in a few minutes. She stood up, looking at Colin. I'm going to get dressed so we can head to the hospital. Are you ready? He nodded. Yes, hurry, you're going to want to take a book to read or something to do. This isn't going to be a fast process. Beverly walked to the dresser and pulled out underwear, before going to the closet for her jeans and a top. Colin was obviously upset that she was taking so long, so he began to pace. He paced up the hallway and down the hallway. Up the hallway and down the hallway. You're making me crazy, Beverly finally said. Come and put my socks and shoes on. I can't find my feet again. This time there was no laughter about how they were still attached. Instead, he knelt on the floor and put her socks and shoes on for her. I feel like a toddler needing someone to put my shoes on. It's not your fault your feet disappeared. It was very rude of them. He finished and stood back up, offering her a hand. Let's go. She waited for a moment for a contraction to pass, before she stood. That one was harder. We need to hurry then. We're fine. Colin, if you get us in a wreck because you're panicking, that will be worse than if we're late. Do you want me to call an ambulance? No. It's my job to get you to the hospital. She shook her head, taking his arm so she had something to lean on if another contraction started. Just move slowly and be careful. All right. He wished she'd hurry as much as she wished he'd slow down. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He swept her up in his arms and carried her to her SUV, putting her into the passenger seat. Buckle. Beverly waited for him to get in after buckling. This baby is not going to be born before we get to the hospital. First babies are notoriously late. What about only babies? I've seen no statistics on only babies. She reached over and patted his arm. Just get me to the hospital in one piece, okay? He drove more recklessly than she would like, but he got them to the hospital safely. He parked at the emergency entrance, and she walked in. I pre-registered for my deliver. I'm Beverly Geller. Would you like a wheelchair, Mrs. Geller? I would love one. Truthfully, after all the years her mother was in a wheelchair, she was loath to sit in one, but she just didn't have the power to get there on her own steam. My husband is parking the car, and he'll be here in a moment. Is that him running through the hall like a madman? The nurse asked, her lips pursed to keep from laughing. I don't even have to look. That's him. He's a bit nervous about this delivery. This must be your first. Only. Beverly turned to watch Colin sprinting through the halls. She was glad it was the middle of the night and the hospital was quiet. When he reached her, he held her suitcase in one hand. I almost forgot your suitcase, but I went back for it. Then I figured I'd better run. All right. She didn't know what else to say to him. He was losing his ever-loving mind, and she needed someone who was calm to help her through this delivery. If I faint, will the doctor be angry? He asked her as he walked beside the wheelchair. The nurse was behind her pushing it. Probably, she said. Doctors don't like sick people. The nurse laughed outright at that. Then why are they doctors? He asked, frowning at her. They're trying to rid the world of sick people. How else will they accomplish it? Beverly was thrilled that she'd come up with a good reason. Sometimes it was all she could do to stay one step ahead of him. The nurse pushed her into an elevator, and he stood in the hall for a moment, as if he was trying to decide if he was going up with them. He jumped in at the last moment. Would you hit 6? The nurse asked. He pushed the button for 6, looking over at Beverly. How are you feeling? Like the giant watermelon I swallowed is trying to come out of me in the worst possible way. The nurse chuckled. I need more patients like you. At least you have a sense of humor about everything. Beverly shrugged. If you can't laugh, you're just going to cry, and no one likes a crybaby. 10 minutes later, they had her settled in a labor room. She was in the bed, and they were attaching one of the machines to her to see how her contractions were measuring, while Colin paced back and forth. What are our options? I don't think this is a good idea. The nurse, a new one who had just met them, looked at him for a moment. Exactly what do you think can be done now? I don't know. I think the baby needs to cook for a while longer, though. My wife isn't ready for the baby to be born. Beverly shook her head at him. Your wife is more than ready. Your wife wants to evict this baby from her temporary home and hold her in her arms. You will not try to slow this process down. She loved the man, but his panic over the baby being born was about to drive her to distraction. But you said you had a few more things you needed to do. I said that on Monday. I did them on Tuesday. We're as ready as we're going to get, so you need to sit down and hush, because I'm about to have this baby, and no one is going to stop me. Now that the time was close, she wasn't nervous at all. She was just ready to hold her baby in her arms. It was time. Colin sat down, but he didn't hush. Every time she felt a contraction, he told her it was time for her to ask for drugs. The good stuff. It was 6 hours later when Sarah was finally born. She had all her fingers and all her toes. She's perfect, Dr. Young told Beverly. You did good. After they'd cleaned her up, one of the nurses brought Sarah to Beverly, and she held her for the first time. Wow. You're a beautiful little thing, aren't you? Colin stood to one side, watching them for a moment. He felt like he had no place in the bonding moment in front of him. He stood with his hands behind his back, silently observing her as she met her baby, her eyes full of tears. Beverly looked up and saw Colin watching her with Sarah. Come see her, she said softly, praying he wouldn't refuse. Sarah was his baby too, and she knew that if he'd just spend a little bit of time with her, he'd love her as much as Beverly did. He walked over and looked down at the baby. She's gray. And kind of wrinkled. That's normal. She has all 10 fingers and 10 toes. And look. Beverly stroked the baby's hand, and she turned and gripped her finger, holding tightly. Do you want to hold her? She held her breath as she waited for an answer. Please let him want to hold her. I'm afraid I'd drop her. You won't. Beverly held her out. You need to support her head with one arm. Hold her close to you. Colin did as she told him, taking the baby from his wife. He stared down at her little face, all at once realizing that this baby was his. Born of his love for Beverly. She's beautiful. I think so. Beverly watched them together for a moment, wondering what he was thinking as he held her. He walked to a chair, holding Sarah close, and looking down into her tiny little face. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. There were tears in his eyes as he said the words. Why are you sorry? I rejected her. From the first moment I knew she existed, I didn't want her. I wanted nothing at all to do with her. She's a human being, a tiny little person. Beverly felt tears spring to her eyes. Yes, she is. She's the only person in the world that's blood related to me now. Everyone else is gone. Me too. He couldn't take his eyes from the baby. She was so much more than he'd ever imagined. She opened her eyes and looked at him steadily for a moment, before closing them again and falling back to sleep. She hadn't looked at him with censure, and she should have. I'm sorry for everything I said. Beverly shook her head. There's no need to apologize. You were honest with how you felt from the very first moment. I'm the one who threw a wrench in things. She smiled at him as he sat there, holding their daughter. I'm just glad you understand now. I do. I don't think I had any idea how much love I would feel as soon as I looked into her tiny little face. She's ours, the perfect blend of the both of us. She'll have my sense of humor and your ability to assemble furniture. My love of crafts and your ability to stare at a television for 3 hours and have no idea of what you watched. He frowned. I do have a few good qualities, you know. I do know that. I'm still working on finding them, but I know they're there. Colin ignored her as he looked at the baby. Your mama likes to tease me. You're going to see that as you grow up, she's going to tease me a lot. But you know what? I don't mind at all. Because I know all her teasing is done in love, and she loves you and me with everything she has inside her. You are the center of her world, and that's how it should be. 3 days later, Colin drove his ladies back home from the hospital. He'd stayed in Beverly's room with her, helping her to care for the baby during the nights. Little Sarah was already showing her personality. She preferred to be up at night and sleeping during the day. When they arrived home, he carried in Sarah's car seat, placing it on the coffee table. "Do you want me to fix supper?" he asked. "You? I don't want something from a can. I want real food," he laughed. "Well, then you're going to have to cook." "I will. Do you want to stay with the baby while I cook? I'm not sure I'll hear her over the kitchen appliances." "I'd love to." And it was true. For as long as he dreaded the idea of her having a baby and him being a father, he was very much in love with the little girl on his coffee table. She was his everything. Well, she and her mother were his everything. A year ago, he'd approached a strange matchmaker, hoping that he could find someone who made him feel less empty. He now had two someones who made his life complete. Thank God for crazy purple-haired matchmakers.